Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the very idea of civilization, that we barely even think about it anymore. We're going to talk about the road, and not just any road, but the incredible, enduring, and frankly completely over-the-top road network built by the Romans. We'll be exploring what a road trip was actually like in the ancient world, and you'll soon see that their version of a long drive involved a little less stopping for cheap coffee and a little more worrying about whether the next inn had bedbugs the size of your thumb. It's a story of remarkable grit, staggering ingenuity, and the kind of long-term vision that is almost hard to comprehend today. Before we get into it, if you enjoy these little late-night history drifts, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It just lets me know you're out there, and it helps our quiet little community grow. As always, I love to see where everyone is listening from. It's really wonderful to think of us all, scattered across the globe, settling in for the night together. So drop a comment and say hello if you feel up to it. But for now, that's enough of that. The main thing is for you to get comfortable. Turn down the lights, pull up the covers, maybe you have a fan going, creating that soft, steady hum. Just let your shoulders relax. Let the day fall away. You don't need to hold on to it anymore. We're going on a journey far away from here, to a time when the world was both bigger and smaller, all at once. Let's ease into tonight's story together. Chapter 1. The Veins of the Empire, Forging the Roman Road Network. To understand the Roman road trip, we first have to understand the road itself, and we have to get one thing straight from the outset. The Romans didn't build their vast, legendary network for tourism. They didn't pave over 50,000 miles of prime real estate across 3 continents, so that families from Gaul could take a scenic holiday to see the pyramids in Egypt. The primary reason, the great engine behind this monumental undertaking, was control. Pure, simple, military control. Imagine you're Rome. You're an expanding power, a city that's getting very, very good at conquering its neighbours. But conquering is the easy part. Holding on to what you've conquered, that's the real challenge. An empire isn't just a big splash of your colour on a map. It's a living, breathing, and often very rebellious organism. You have to be able to collect taxes, deliver messages, and most importantly, move large numbers of heavily armed men from point A to point B very, very quickly. If a tribe in northern Britannia decides they've had quite enough of Roman rule, you can't afford to have your legions take 6 months to get there, slogging through knee-deep mud and getting lost in primordial forests. By the time they arrived, the rebels would have already minted their own coins and started a book club. The roads were the empire's nervous system. They were the physical manifestation of Roman authority, a declaration etched into the landscape itself. Every straight paved mile was a reminder of who was in charge, and the very first, the great blueprint for them all, was the Via Appia, the Appian Way, begun in 312 BC by a censor named Appius Claudius Caecus, a man whose ambition was clearly as unshakable as his stonework. The Via Appia was the proof of concept. It was Rome saying, "We are going to connect our capital to the far-flung parts of our territory, and we are not going to let a little thing like geography stand in our way." They called it the Regina Viarum, the Queen of Roads, and for good reason. It was the first, and in many ways, the greatest. It set the standard. It showed what was possible when you combined immense willpower with brilliant engineering and an almost unlimited supply of labour. Appius Claudius, bless his forward-thinking heart, basically decided that winning wars was directly related to having a good solid surface to walk on. It sounds simple, but it was utterly revolutionary. So, you've decided you need a road. You need to connect a strategic port to a troublesome frontier. How do you even begin? The world, after all, is a messy, inconveniently shaped place. It's full of hills, valleys, rivers, forests, and swamps, none of which are particularly concerned with your logistical problems. This is where the Roman surveyors come in, the agrimensors. These were the unsung geniuses of the Roman world, part engineer, part artist, part mathematician. Their job was to impose a beautiful, brutal, and uncompromising order upon the chaos of nature. Forget GPS. Forget satellite imagery. A Roman surveyor worked with an instrument that was both incredibly simple and profoundly clever, the grommer. Picture a long staff stuck into the ground. At the top, a horizontal cross is balanced, with a plumb line, a weight on a string hanging from the end of each of the four arms. That's it. It's a giant primitive plus sign. By looking along the strings of the plumb lines, a surveyor could sight a perfectly straight line over vast distances, marking the path with poles. They would stand on a hilltop, squinting into the hazy distance, their grommer a stark piece of geometry against the wild landscape, and they would plot a course. And the course was almost always straight. The Roman obsession with straightness is legendary. They didn't really do winding country lanes. A Roman road had one purpose: efficiency. It was designed by the military, for the military, and an army on the march values the shortest possible distance. If a hill was in the way, they didn't patiently go around it. They would, if at all possible, cut straight through it. If a valley was in the way, they wouldn't dip down and climb back up. They would build a massive causeway or a bridge straight across it. There's an incredible arrogance to it, a statement of dominance over the natural world. The road wasn't just a path, it was a scar of civilization, a line of logic drawn across the face of the earth. Imagine the sheer mental fortitude required. You're a surveyor, standing with your small team in the middle of a dense, dark German forest or a rocky Spanish mountain range. Your job is to say, "The road goes here," pointing through 1,000 tons of rock or a swamp that has swallowed livestock whole. You are, in essence, drawing the blueprint for a war against geography itself. And you're doing it with little more than sticks, string, and an unshakable belief in the power of a right angle. It was the ancient world's version of a laser level, powered entirely by gravity and an almost fanatical level of patience. Once the surveyors had done their work, once the path was marked out by a series of tall stakes driven into the ground, the real heavy lifting began. A Roman road wasn't just a sprinkle of gravel on a dirt path. Oh no, that would be far too simple, too temporary. A Roman road was built to last for eternity. Many of them, in fact, have. You can still walk on parts of the Via Appia today, on paving stones laid down over 2 millennia ago. The secret was in the construction, a sophisticated layering process that was as much a science as an art. First, the legionary engineers would clear the marked path. Trees were felled, bushes were uprooted, and topsoil was scraped away. Then they would dig a trench, the fossa. This trench could be several feet deep. They were getting down to a solid bedrock or a firm, stable layer of ground. This was the foundation of the foundation. They weren't building on shifting soil. Into this trench went the first layer, the statumen. This was a bed of large fist-sized or even head-sized stones, often cemented together with clay or mortar. Think of it as the road skeleton. It provided a solid, stable base, and crucially, excellent drainage. The Romans understood, perhaps better than anyone until the 20th century, that water is the mortal enemy of a road. Puddles and frost are what turn a perfectly good path into a muddy, impassable bog. The statumen ensured that any water that seeped through the upper layers would have somewhere to go, rather than sitting there and undermining the entire structure. On top of this brawny layer of rock came the rudus. This was a much finer layer, a concrete-like mixture of smaller stones, gravel, sand, and lime mortar, packed down to a dense, hard layer about 9 inches thick. The sound of this stage must have been immense. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of men, tamping this layer down with heavy tools, a rhythmic, earth-shaking thump, thump, thump that would have echoed for miles. This was the road's muscle, the layer that would bear the immense weight of marching legions, heavy supply wagons, and relentless foot traffic for centuries to come. Next came the nucleus, the core. This was an even finer layer of Roman concrete, a mix of sand, lime, and gravel, sometimes with crushed tile or pottery mixed in for added strength. This was laid down like a thick, wet screed and smoothed out, creating an incredibly hard, durable, and waterproof base for the final surface. It was like the final layer of primer before the paint. And finally, the crowning glory, the summum dorsum, or pavimentum. This was the visible surface of the road, the part we imagine when we think of Roman roads. It consisted of huge, multi-sided paving stones, polygonal blocks of the hardest local stone available, like basalt or flint, fitted together with the precision of a master jigsaw puzzler. They were so tightly packed that you often couldn't slip a knife blade between them. This surface was not flat. The Romans engineered their roads with a slight camber, a gentle curve that made the center a few inches higher than the edges. It's a brilliantly simple piece of design. Any rain that fell on the road would immediately run off into the drainage ditches, sulci that ran alongside it. No puddles, no erosion, just a clean, dry, all-weather surface. If you think your neighbor is impressive for laying a new patio in his back garden over a weekend, just try to comprehend the scale of this. This meticulous four-layer process was repeated, mile after agonizing mile, across plains, through forests and over mountains. It was an assembly line of earth-moving, stone-crushing and back-breaking labor on an almost unimaginable scale. The finished product was less a road and more a long, thin fortress foundation. It was over-engineered to a degree that is almost comical, built not for the next decade, but for the next millennium. So who exactly was doing all this work? Who were the thousands of souls whose sweat and toil were mixed into the mortar of these imperial arteries? The workforce was a cross-section of Roman society itself. At the top of the pyramid were the legionary engineers. The Roman legionary was not just a grunt soldier trained to fight. He was part of a highly disciplined, multi-skilled unit. When they weren't actively fighting, legions were kept busy with massive construction projects. It kept them fit, it kept them disciplined, and it kept them from getting bored and causing trouble, which is always a risk when you have thousands of trained killers sitting around with nothing to do. These men were the skilled labor, the project managers. They understood the principles of surveying, engineering, and logistics. Building roads, forts, and aqueducts was as much a part of their job description as marching in formation or wielding a gladius. Beneath them, you had a vast pool of auxiliary troops and conscripted local labor. When the Romans conquered a new territory, they had a very practical approach to civic engagement. It often involved telling the local population, "Congratulations on becoming part of the Roman Empire. To celebrate, you're all going to help us build this enormous road. You'll find it makes it much easier for us to march our armies into your villages. Should you ever reconsider your newfound loyalty?" It was a form of taxation paid in sweat and muscle. While perhaps not the most enthusiastic of workers, they provided the raw manpower needed for the immense task of digging, hauling, and crushing stone. And then, of course, there was the grim foundation upon which so much of the ancient world was built: slave labor, prisoners of war, captured peoples, and those unfortunate enough to be born into servitude were put to work in the quarries, digging out the millions of tons of rock needed for the roadbeds, and performing the most grueling, repetitive, and dangerous tasks. We tend to romanticize the gleaming marble of Rome and the clean lines of its engineering, but it's important to remember the immense human cost. The sheer physical output required to build a single mile of Roman road was staggering, and much of that energy came from people who had no choice in the matter. The sounds of a Roman road construction site must have been a true symphony of industry. The rhythmic clang of sledgehammers on stone in the quarries, the creak and groan of heavy ox carts hauling rubble, the sharp commands of the foreman, the murmur of 100 different languages from the conscripted locals, and the steady, relentless scraping and digging of thousands of shovels. It was the sound of an empire imposing its will upon the world, one carefully placed paving stone at a time. When you zoom out from the construction of a single road, the bigger picture is even more breathtaking. The Romans didn't just build a few good roads, they built a network, a web. The system eventually spanned over 400,000 kilometers, or 250,000 miles, of which more than 80,000 kilometers, 50,000 miles, were paved to the high standard we just discussed. That is an astonishing figure. It's enough paved road to circle the entire planet twice. And at the very heart of this network, in the Roman Forum, stood a single monument, the Miliaria Maureum, the Golden Milestone. Erected by the Emperor Augustus, this gilded bronze column was the symbolic heart of the empire. It was point zero. All distances in the empire were measured from this single spot. The famous saying, "All roads lead to Rome," wasn't just a metaphor for the city's cultural and political importance. It was, for the most part, a literal statement of engineering fact. From this one point, the veins of the empire pulsed outwards, carrying soldiers, governors, tax collectors, and messages to the furthest, wildest fringes of the known world. This network wasn't just for the army, though. Once built, it became the essential framework for imperial administration, and this brings us to one of the most brilliant, and perhaps most underappreciated Roman innovations, the cursus publicus. This was the state-run mail and transport service. Think of it as the world's first postal service combined with a government-only Uber system. It wasn't for public use. You couldn't use it to send a birthday card to your aunt in Pompeii. It was exclusively for carrying official correspondence, magistrates, senators, and military officials. Along the major roads, the government established a series of way stations at regular intervals. There were the smaller stations, the mutations, located every 10 miles or so. Here, a government courier could arrive, dismount from his exhausted horse, and immediately get a fresh one, allowing him to continue his journey at top speed. Then, every 25 to 30 miles, roughly a good day's journey, there was a mansio. These were much larger complexes, essentially full-service hotels for government employees. A travelling official could find a hot meal, a bath, a bed for the night, and stables for his animals. The cursus publicus was a system of incredible efficiency. A vital dispatch could travel across the empire at a relentless pace, passed from rider to rider, horse to horse, day and night. It's estimated that a message could travel up to 50 miles a day under normal circumstances, and in an emergency with riders pushing their horses to the limit, that could be trebled. This meant that the emperor in Rome could receive a report from the governor of Britain in a matter of weeks, not months. It allowed for a level of command and control over a vast territory that was simply unprecedented in human history. The roads were the hardware, but the cursus publicus was the high-speed data network that ran on them. It was what allowed a single city on the Tiber to effectively manage a territory that stretched from the grey seas of Scotland to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia. So this is the stage upon which our Roman road trip will take place, not on a quaint dirt track, but on a marvel of engineering, a superhighway of the ancient world, a road that was conceived in military strategy, surveyed with geometric precision, built with layers of incredible durability, and powered by the muscles of a vast and varied workforce. These roads were more than just infrastructure. They were the skeleton of the empire, the conduits of its power, the very lines that held the whole, sprawling, magnificent and brutal enterprise together. They were a promise, written in stone, that wherever you went, from the vineyards of Gaul to the deserts of Africa, you were still in Rome. And now that we understand the road, we can begin to imagine what it was actually like to travel upon it. Chapter 2. The Traveller's Burden. Planning and packing for a Roman journey. And now that we understand the road, we can begin to imagine what it was actually like to travel upon it. The great promise of the road, written in stone, is a beautiful, abstract concept. But as you stand at the threshold of your cramped apartment in the Suburra district of Rome, or on the porch of your villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, you are confronted with a much more immediate and humbling reality. The promise of the road does not pack your bags for you. Before a single dusty sandal is placed upon those masterfully engineered paving stones, a journey begins not with a step, but with a thought, a calculation, a deep, soul-searching inventory of needs, fears, and possibilities. The modern idea of a spontaneous road trip, of just hopping in a vehicle to see where the wind takes you, would have been utterly, dangerously incomprehensible to a Roman. See where the wind takes you? To a ditch, most likely. Or into a forest clearing, where a group of very unfriendly men with clubs would be delighted to help you lighten your load. No, a Roman journey was a campaign. Whether you were a merchant calculating profit margins against the risk of shipwreck, a governor heading to a new provincial post, or a simple soldier on leave trying to get home to see his family, your trip was preceded by a period of intense and often anxious preparation. It was a project, managed with varying degrees of resources, but always with the same underlying understanding. The world outside the city walls was not a theme park. It was a vast, unpredictable space, where foresight was the currency of survival. So let's begin our own journey, not on the road itself, but in the mind of the traveller. The first and most fundamental question is, of course, where are we going, and how on earth do we get there? You wouldn't be pulling up a shimmering satellite view map on a glowing rectangle. The very concept of a geographically accurate two-scale map for the everyday person simply didn't exist. What you would have if you were literate and had a bit of money was something called an itinerarium. An itinerary. Think of it less like a map and more like those first-generation turn-by-turn directions you used to print out online. It was a list, a simple, practical, text-based scroll that told you what you needed to know, and absolutely nothing more. It would list in order the towns, the way stations, and the major stops along your chosen route. Next to each stop would be a number, the distance in Roman miles from the previous point. It was pure data. It didn't show you the shape of the coastline. It didn't tell you if a mountain range to your left was particularly majestic. It had one job: to get you from point A to point B without getting hopelessly lost. The Antonine itinerary, one of the most famous surviving examples, is exactly this: a massive ledger of routes, a kind of phone book for the Roman road network. Route 1, from the wall in Britain to the port of Lemanus, 156 Roman miles. It then lists every major stop along the way: Braminium, Coria, Vindamora, each with its corresponding mileage. It was your Bible, your guide, your single source of truth in a world without road signs. You'd follow it religiously, counting the miles, watching for the next named town on the list, as if it were a promised land. For the visual thinkers among the Roman elite, there was a more peculiar tool. We have a stunning surviving example, a medieval copy of a much older Roman original called the Tabula Peutingeriana. And if you ever see it, your first thought is that something has gone terribly wrong. It's a scroll, but it's nearly 22 feet long and only about 1 foot high. It looks as though someone took a map of the known world and fed it through a pasta roller. Italy is stretched sideways, a long green bean of a peninsula. The Mediterranean Sea is a narrow, meandering river. Cities that are geographically far apart north to south are squashed right next to each other. It's bizarre, and for a moment you'd think it was useless, but then you realize what it is. It's not a map of the world. It's a diagram of the road network. It's a schematic, like a modern subway map. A subway map doesn't show you the real-world distance between stops, or the precise curves of the tunnels. It just shows you the order of the stops and where the lines connect. That's the Tabula Peutingeriana. It was designed for the traveller. The red lines are the roads. The little icons of buildings are the towns and cities. The names are written clearly, and the numbers between them are the distances. It's a visual itinerary, a graphical representation of the list, designed so a wealthy traveller could sweep his finger along his route, from Rome, through Capua, across the sea to Carthage, and see his entire journey laid out as a single, comprehensible line. It sacrifices geographical reality for logistical clarity, and on the road logistics are everything. Of course, these were tools for the literate, for the wealthy, for the official, for the average person, the farmer, the legionary, the peddler. Navigation was a more organic process. You knew the next town was a day's walk away because you'd walked it 100 times. You asked for directions. You followed the great stone road, trusting that the empire knew where it was going, and you kept an eye out for the milestones. These were the physical pings of the Roman GPS. At every Roman mile along the major routes stood a miliarium, a stout stone column, often taller than a man, carved with inscriptions. It would tell you the distance to the nearest major city. Most importantly, somewhere on it was the name of the emperor who had built, or more likely repaired, that stretch of road. They were part public service, part propaganda. They reassured you, letting you know that you were X miles from Londinium, while also gently reminding you that Emperor Hadrian paid for this road, so you should probably say something nice about him at the next inn. For the traveller, they were a comfort, a steady, rhythmic confirmation that you were in fact still on the path and making progress. They were the slow, steady heartbeat of the road itself. Now, with a route in mind, whether it's a detailed itinerary or just a general direction, the real work begins: packing. And here, more than anywhere else, we see the immense, almost unbridgeable chasm between the Roman social classes. A journey for a senator and a journey for a shoemaker were not just different in comfort, they were different experiences of reality. Let us first imagine we are preparing for a trip with Gaius Licinius Macer, a senator of considerable wealth, who has been appointed governor of a minor province in Greece. Gaius is not packing a bag. Gaius is mobilizing a small army. His departure from his Roman villa will look less like a family vacation and more like a theatrical procession. The planning would have begun weeks, if not months, in advance. Managed by his chief slave, his dispensator, carts must be procured, not just any carts, but a fleet of them. There will be the heavy, slow-moving ridae, the four-wheeled wagons that are essentially moving vans. These will carry the bulk of the household goods. We're talking about crates of silverware, folded tables and chairs made of fine wood, bronze braziers for heating, chests of linens, and of course a truly staggering amount of clothing for Gaius, his wife, and their children. Nothing so vulgar as wearing the same toga twice in a week, even in the provinces. Then there is the kitchen cart, a mobile pantry staffed by the family cook and his assistants, laden with amphorae of fine wine from his own estate, jars of expensive honey, sacks of special flour, and imported spices. Gaius will not be subjecting his refined palate to the questionable fare of roadside taverns if he can help it. For the family itself, there is the carica dormitoria, the sleeping carriage. This was the Roman equivalent of a luxury RV, a large, well-sprung wagon, often covered with leather or cloth curtains, and spacious enough to be outfitted with cushions and mattresses. It was a private, mobile room, designed to insulate its occupants from the dust, the sun, and the sight of the common folk. His wife and children might spend most of the daylight hours in there, reading, playing games, or sleeping. Gaius himself might ride ahead on a fine horse, or in a faster, more stylish two-wheeled carriage called a Cisium, but he is never alone. He is surrounded by an entourage that broadcasts his status and ensures his security. There are his secretaries and clerks, carrying his writing materials and official documents. There are body slaves to attend to his personal needs. There are outriders on horseback, a mix of servants and hired muscle, who serve as a visible deterrent to any would-be bandits. There might even be a small troop of soldiers, if his posting is official. His packing list is less about survival, and more about transplanting his entire lifestyle. He packs his identity. He packs his favourite books, scrolls of Greek philosophy and Roman history. He packs his polished bronze mirror and his ivory combs. He might even pack a portable mosaic floor, rolled up, so that a skilled slave can lay it in his tent or provincial residence, making it feel instantly like home. For Gaius, the traveller's burden is not a weight on his back, but the immense logistical and financial burden of ensuring that, wherever he goes, his bubble of Roman aristocratic comfort remains completely intact. He is not so much travelling through the world as he is rolling his own world over it. Now let's leave Gaius and his procession to clog up the road and visit Lucius, a merchant who sells pottery. Lucius is planning a trip from Ostia, the port of Rome, to Capua, a journey of about 130 miles down the famous Via Appia. For Lucius, every item packed is a calculation of weight versus necessity. His transport is not a fleet of carriages, but one sturdy mule, maybe two, loaded with his wares, and a small, functional cart. He may even walk alongside to spare the animal. Lucius's preparations are his own. He checks the axle on his cart, greasing it with animal fat. He inspects the mule's hooves and shoes. He mends any tears in his leather bags. His world is practical, tactile. His burden is real and physical. So what does he pack for himself? First, food, the lifeblood of the journey. He won't be carrying fresh bread and roasted dormice. He packs what lasts. The core of his diet on the road will be panis militaris, the soldier's bread, or what we would call hardtack. It's a simple biscuit of flour, water and salt, baked twice until it is rock hard and completely devoid of moisture. It's not food you enjoy, it's fuel you consume. You'd break it up with a rock, or soak it in water, wine or sour wine, posca, to make it remotely chewable. It had the shelf life of a ceramic pot, and some would joke, a similar texture. Alongside this, he would have a wedge of hard, salty cheese, a string of dried figs or dates, a handful of olives, and perhaps a chunk of salted fish or bacon, wrapped carefully in a cloth. It's a diet of salt, starch and sustenance. Monotonous, but it won't spoil. Next, water. This is a constant concern. He carries a water skin, likely a treated goat or sheep bladder called a cullius. It's slung over his shoulder, or tied to the mule. It's heavy, awkward, and gives the water a distinct leathery goaty flavour. It's not Perrier. The goal is not refreshment, but hydration. He would refill it at every opportunity. A town well, a clean stream, a fountain at a villa he passes, because he never knows when the next reliable source will be. He might also carry a flask of cheap wine, not just for the pleasure of it, but because it was often safer than water of a dubious origin. A little alcohol could kill some of the germs. Then, clothing. What you see him wearing is likely most of what he owns, a simple knee-length tunic of undyed wool. It's itchy, it's hot in the sun, it's heavy when it rains, but it's durable and surprisingly warm on a cold night. Over this he has his cloak. The cloak is the single most important piece of gear for the common traveller. It could be a simple rectangle of thick wool, or the more sophisticated hooded version, the penedula. The penedula was a marvel of practicality, a large, often circular piece of heavy, lanolin-rich wool with a hole for your head. It was your raincoat, your windbreaker, your sunshade. At night it was your blanket. When you sat on the hard ground, it was your cushion. A good cloak was a portable home, your shield against the elements. He might pack one spare tunic, a precious luxury to be able to change out of sweat-soaked or rain-drenched clothes at the end of a long day, and on his feet, sturdy military-style sandals or hobnailed boots. The Caligai, he knows every strap and stud on them, because he knows his journey ends the moment they fail. This leads to the repair kit. No one is coming to fix his broken cart. He packs a small leather pouch with the essentials, a sharp knife, which serves as a tool, a weapon, and an eating utensil, an awl, and some leather cord for fixing his sandals or his bags, a needle and some sturdy thread, maybe a few spare hobnails for his boots. He is his own mechanic, his own tailor, his own salvation. And finally, money. A journey costs money. The inns aren't free, tolls sometimes have to be paid, and you might need to buy fodder for your mule. He wouldn't carry a large sack of gold. He would have a mix of silver and bronze coins, silver denarii and bronze sestertii and asses. He keeps them in a cloth pouch, or more securely, in a heavy leather belt worn under his tunic. It's a constant source of anxiety. The weight of the belt is a comforting reminder of his funds, but also a terrifying vulnerability. Every stranger he meets on the road is a potential business partner, but also a potential thief who might hear the clink of coin and see an opportunity. Now, let's descend one final step on the social ladder. Let's imagine Marcus, a young man from a small village who has saved for a year to make a pilgrimage to a famous temple 100 miles away. Or perhaps he's a discharged legionary, walking home after 25 years of service. He isn't leading a mule, he isn't driving a cart, he is just a man, on foot, with the world on his back. His is the truest traveller's burden. His pack, the sarcina, is a bundle tied to the end of a long wooden pole, which he carries over his shoulder. This was the classic image of the Roman soldier on the march, and it was adopted by all long-distance walkers because it distributed the weight. In that bundle is his entire world, one spare tunic, his cloak, rolled tight, a small bag containing his hardtack and a piece of cheese, a wooden cup, a small clay oil lamp, and a tiny flask of oil, a precious defence against the absolute dark of a rural night. His life savings, maybe a few dozen bronze coins, are sewn into the hem of his tunic. He has no repair kit beyond a knife. If his sandals break, he will try to fix them with a strip of bark, or he will walk barefoot. He sleeps not in inns which he cannot afford, but in open-air shelters called kopane, or more likely, just off the road, wrapped in his cloak with his walking pole as a makeshift weapon beside him. For Marcus, every ounce matters. His journey is a brutal equation of calories burned versus calories carried. He drinks from streams and hopes for the best. He forages for berries if he can. His plan is simple. Put one foot in front of the other, follow the big road, and pray to the gods that his health, his money, and his luck hold out until he reaches his destination. Across all these classes, though, there was one item that could be more valuable than food or money: paperwork, specifically letters of introduction. The Roman world ran on networks of patronage and personal connection. If you were travelling to a town where you knew no one, a letter from a mutual acquaintance of high standing was a golden ticket. It wasn't just a polite formality. A letter from a senator addressed to a local magistrate could secure you a comfortable room, an invitation to dinner, legal protection, and vital local knowledge. It vouched for you. It told the world you were a person of substance, not a vagabond or a runaway slave. Two categories of people who often met very unpleasant ends. You would present this sealed scroll upon your arrival, and doors would open for an official on government business. This was formalized. He carried a bronze or wooden diploma, a sort of official warrant from the emperor himself. This was the passport for the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and transport system. This warrant entitled the bearer to demand fresh horses, food and lodging from the official way stations, mansions, set up along the major roads. It was a powerful document, essentially a credit card backed by the full authority of the Roman state, and it was a system ripe for abuse by officials who used it for their own luxurious private travels. So we see the spectrum of preparation, from Gaius, who packs a portable civilization, to Lucius, who packs for a business venture, to Marcus, who packs only for bare survival. Each of them, in their own way, is trying to impose order on the inherent chaos of the road. They are trying to anticipate the needs of the body, hunger, thirst, cold, and the dangers of the world, robbery, fraud, loneliness. And the choice of transport was a key part of this calculation. We've spoken of walking, the great universal default. It was slow, 15 to 20 miles on a good day, but it was free. A horse could double or triple that speed, but it was expensive to buy and needed to be fed. A mule was slower than a horse, but hardier and cheaper, the perfect beast of burden for a merchant. For those with goods or families, there were the wagons. The speedy two-wheeled Sisyum was the taxi of the ancient world, often available for hire near city gates for a quick trip to a nearby town. It was light, fast and bone-jarringly uncomfortable. The heavy four-wheeled raider was the freight truck, or the family minivan. It was slow, cumbersome, and probably travelled at little more than a walking pace, but it could carry a whole family and their possessions. The creak and groan of its ungreased wooden wheels was one of the signature sounds of the Roman road. So the plan is laid, the itinerary is consulted, the social calculus of what to pack is complete, the money is secured, the crucial letters of introduction are tucked safely away, the mule is loaded, the carriage is ready, or the walking pole is settled on the shoulder. Our traveller, be he senator, merchant, or pilgrim, stands at the city gate, looking out at the long, straight line of the road disappearing into the horizon. The sun is climbing, the noise of the city is behind him, the relative quiet of the countryside is ahead. Everything up to this point has been theoretical, a list, a map, a plan. It has been an act of imagination and foresight. But now, the real journey begins. Now the traveller must commit his body to the stone, the dust, and the endless miles. The traveller's burden is no longer a concept, but a real and pressing weight, and with that first step out from under the shadow of the gate, the carefully constructed plan makes contact with the unpredictable, messy, and often dangerous reality of the open road. Now he just has to survive its execution. Chapter 3. The Daily Grind. Rhythm and reality on the open road. And so the execution begins. It begins not with a grand gesture, not with a heroic stride, but with a shiver in the pre-dawn dark. It begins in the cold, musty air of a roadside inn, or perhaps under a simple wool blanket beside the dying embers of a campfire. The plan, so neatly conceived in the warm lamplight of a city home, now feels 1,000 miles away. The only reality is the ache in the bones and the profound, silent darkness that presses in from all sides. This is the first rule of the Roman road. You move when the sun does not. The traveller's day starts long before the first hint of light crests the horizon. To be awake and moving in the cool, damp air of the morning is not a virtue. It is a tactical necessity. The real enemy of any journey, more so than bandits or bad roads, is the relentless, oppressive Mediterranean sun, and so you rise in the dark. The air is thin and carries a chill that seems to seep right through your tunic. If you are in an inn, a copona, the sounds are of other people stirring, a muffled cough, the groan of a man rolling over on a straw mattress, the distant braying of a mule already being loaded in the courtyard. There is no gentle wake-up call, no slow easing into the day. There is only the abrupt transition from a fitful, shallow sleep to the immediate demands of the road. Your first act is not to stretch, but to check your belongings. A quick, subtle pat of the money pouch tied securely beneath your tunic. A glance to ensure your pack or saddlebags haven't been disturbed in the night. Trust is a luxury afforded to those who stay in one place. On the road, a healthy paranoia is your closest companion. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a Spartan affair. It's not a meal, it's an ingestion of fuel. There is no sitting down to a hot plate of anything. It's a piece of hard, dry bread, the kind that scrapes the roof of your mouth, perhaps softened with a gulp of water or sour wine. Maybe a handful of olives or a chunk of hard, salty cheese that you've been carrying for days. You eat it standing, or while making a final check of your mule's load, or while retying the laces on your hobnailed sandals. The Caligai. The goal is to get moving before the world is truly awake, to steal a few miles from the day before the sun can claim them. As you step out of the inn's courtyard or break camp, the road is a grey ribbon unfurling into the gloom. The great stone slabs are cold and slick with dew. The world is rendered in shades of grey and deep blue. This is the quietest the road will ever be. The only sounds are your own, the crunch of your footsteps, the rhythmic clop-clop of your donkey's hooves, the gentle creak of leather. For a short, precious while, the road is yours. You feel a flicker of the romance you imagined back in your study. The air is clean, the world is still, and the journey ahead feels possible, even noble. But the road, like time, belongs to no one. Soon you hear it, a distant rumble, the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on stone. The sound grows, and soon you are pressing yourself to the side of the road as a massive freight wagon, a carross, thunders past, pulled by a team of straining mules, its driver shouting curses into the morning air. Then another. Soon, the road awakens. It becomes a living thing, a great artery pumping the lifeblood of the empire across the landscape. Now the sun begins its ascent, and with it comes the second great antagonist of the journey, the dust. On the paved sections, the via strata, the problem is less pronounced. But Roman roads were not universally paved highways from coast to coast. They were a network. The main arteries were magnificent, but the secondary roads, the via glerata, were packed gravel, and the tertiary tracks, the via terrana, were little more than beaten earth. And on these, the dust was a malevolent entity. It was a fine, choking powder, kicked up by every footstep, every hoof, every wheel. It coated your clothes, turning your tunic a uniform shade of beige. It worked its way into your hair, your eyes, your nostrils. You could feel the grit of it between your teeth. You breathed it in until your throat was raw. It was the taste and smell of travel itself. When you stopped for a drink, you were washing down a mouthful of dust with your water. It was the ghost of the road, and it haunted every traveller, every single mile. And the miles themselves, they were not an abstract concept. They were a physical, tangible presence marked out for all to see. Every 1,000 paces, every Roman mile was marked by a milliarium, a milestone. These were not quaint little markers. They were stout stone columns, sometimes 6 or 7 feet tall, planted firmly by the side of the road. Carved into the stone was the distance to the next major city, and often the name of the emperor who had built or repaired this stretch of road. They were a brilliant piece of imperial infrastructure and propaganda rolled into one. For the weary traveller, the milestones were a source of both comfort and despair. They were the Roman equivalent of a GPS, a stoic, unblinking confirmation that you were, in fact, still on the right path. They proved that you were making progress, that Rome's order extended even here, into this wild Gallic forest, or across this bleak Spanish plain. Seeing a milestone was a psychological boost, a small victory in the long war against distance. But they were also a cruel accountant. They told you in unflinching terms just how little progress you had made. You could walk for what felt like an eternity, your legs burning, your back aching, only to reach the next milestone and see the number tick down by a single solitary digit. They were a constant reminder of the sheer, vast, soul-crushing scale of the world you were trying to cross. 1 mile down, and 99 to go. The milestones did not care about your blisters. They just stood there, silently judging your pace. The pace itself was a slow, grinding rhythm. A traveller on foot, a viator, in good health and with a light pack, might hope to cover 15 to 20 miles in a day. That was a good day, 20 miles of walking, from before dawn until dusk. Think about that, walking a near marathon, day after day after day, for weeks or months on end. If you had a donkey or a mule to carry your baggage, you might not be any faster, but you would arrive at the end of the day with slightly more of your spirit intact. A traveller in a light carriage, a Sicilium, might cover 25 or 30 miles. The imperial courier service, the cursus publicus, with its network of relay stations and fresh horses, could achieve incredible speeds, sometimes over 100 miles in a day. But that was the absolute peak of Roman travel. the equivalent of a chartered jet. For everyone else, it was the speed of a footstep, the speed of a hoof. The road was also a social space, a rolling, linear community of strangers. You were rarely truly alone. You would fall into pace for a while, with a squad of legionaries marching to a new posting, their armor jingling in a steady metallic rhythm. They were often the safest company you could keep, their presence a powerful deterrent to any would-be robber. You'd listen to their barracks humor, their complaints about the food and the local women, their easy camaraderie a world away from your own solitary concerns. You would overtake a merchant train, a long line of heavily laden mules plodding patiently onward, guarded by hired men with watchful eyes. The air around them would be thick with the smell of their cargo spices from the east, wine from Campania, olive oil from Spain. You would hear a babble of languages at a crossroad, not just Latin but Greek, which was the lingua franca of the Eastern Empire, and then the local tongues, Celtic whispers in Gaul, guttural Germanic phrases near the Rhine, the Aramaic of Syrian traders. The road was a testament to the sheer magnificent diversity of the empire, all these different peoples bound together by these ribbons of stone. You would encounter the functionaries of the state, at the edge of a province or near a major city. You might be stopped by a public notice, a tax collector. These were universally despised figures. They would inspect your goods, assess their value, and demand a toll. The process was often arbitrary, the potential for corruption enormous. Arguing was pointless. You paid the fee, swallowed your resentment, and moved on. The encounter would leave a sour taste in your mouth, a reminder that the peace and order of the Roman world came at a price, and that price was always being collected. Then there were the messengers, the tabellari, moving at a determined, hurried pace, their leather satchels holding letters, legal documents, business contracts, the invisible threads of communication that held the empire together. They had no time for pleasantries. They had a destination and a deadline, and you were just an obstacle to be passed. By mid-morning, the sun would be high enough to be a serious concern. The initial coolness of the day was a distant memory, replaced by a growing, shimmering heat. The world seemed to bleach out. The colours became less vibrant. The dust became thicker. The initial energy of the morning had burned off, and now the grind truly began. This was the long, monotonous middle of the day. The landscape, which had seemed novel and interesting at dawn, now became repetitive. Another hill, another valley, another vineyard, another olive grove. The rhythmic squeak of your cart's axle, or the plodding of your own feet, became a hypnotic, mind-numbing drone. Your thoughts would turn inward. You would think of home, of the reasons for your journey, of the cool drink you hoped to have at the end of the day. It was a battle against boredom as much as fatigue. As the sun reached its zenith, the world would come to a halt. This was the hora sexta, the 6th hour, high noon. To continue travelling in the full heat of the day was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. This was the time for the Roman version of a siesta. Everyone who could would seek shelter. You'd pull off the road, hopefully finding a stand of trees, a milestone that offered a sliver of shade, or perhaps a roadside station, a mutatio where you could water your animals. Lunch was again a profoundly unglamorous affair. More hard bread, maybe some fruit if you were lucky enough to have passed a vendor. You would unstopper your water skin. The water would be warm and taste of the leather it was stored in. But it was the most precious thing you owned. You'd drink it slowly, rationing it. You might see other travellers doing the same thing, gathered in the same small patch of shade. There was little conversation, a nod of acknowledgement, a shared glance of weary understanding. Everyone was simply trying to survive the heat, to gather their strength for the second half of the day. In this shared, silent moment of respite, the soldier, the merchant, the tax collector, and the simple traveller were all equals under the tyranny of the sun. This midday pause was also a time of vulnerability. To be asleep by the side of the road was to be an easy target. You would try to rest, but some part of your mind would remain on high alert, listening for any approaching footsteps, keeping a hand near the small knife at your belt. The quiet of the midday was not peaceful, it was watchful. Then, as the sun began its slow descent in the west, the rhythm would start again. You'd heave yourself to your feet, your body stiff and protesting. The first few hundred steps were the worst. The heat was still immense, a physical weight pressing down on you. The afternoon was, in many ways, the hardest part of the day. Your reserves of energy were low. The promise of your destination still seemed impossibly far away. This was a battle of pure will. Your mind would start playing tricks on you. A shimmering in the distance would look like a lake. A distant farm building would be mistaken for the town you were aiming for. The milestones became your tormentors once more, each one a testament to your agonizingly slow progress. The goal now was simple: reach a safe place to stay before nightfall. To be caught on the open road after dark was every traveler's greatest fear. Darkness was when the real dangers emerged. The bandits, the wild animals, the simple terrifying risk of losing your way or taking a bad fall on the uneven stone. And so, as the afternoon wore on, a new urgency would set in. You would push your pace, ignoring the protests of your aching muscles. You would start scanning the horizon, looking for the telltale sign of a settlement, a column of smoke, the roof of a large building, the walls of a town. The light would begin to change. The harsh white glare of the afternoon would soften into the golden hues of evening. The shadows would lengthen, stretching long fingers across the road. The air would begin to cool. This was the most beautiful time of day on the road, but it was impossible to enjoy it. It was a clock, ticking down. Finally, you would see it, your destination for the night. Perhaps it was a mansio, a large state-run hotel on a major route, offering relatively decent food and lodging. More likely, it was a private inn, a corpona, with a reputation that was probably much worse than you'd like to imagine. Or maybe it was a small walled town where you could find lodging, or, at the very least, a safe place to unroll your bedroll. The feeling of arrival was not one of triumphant joy, but of profound, bone-deep relief. You had made it. You had survived another day. As you approached the town gates, you might face another publicanus, another toll. Inside, the streets would be bustling with people finishing their day's work. The smells would change from the dust of the road to the smell of cooking fires, of animals in their pens, of human life crowded together. Finding a place at an inn was your final challenge. You would enter the courtyard, a noisy, chaotic space filled with other travelers, carts being unloaded, animals being fed and watered. The innkeeper, the corpo, would eye you up and down, assessing how much he could charge you. The prices were not fixed. They were a negotiation. And you, a weary traveller, were in a poor bargaining position. The inn itself was rarely a place of comfort. The word hospitality would be doing a lot of heavy lifting. The ground floor was typically a tavern, a smoky, loud room filled with off-duty soldiers, rough-looking teamsters, and other travellers, all drinking cheap sour wine and exchanging stories. The noise was a constant roar. Fights were common. This was not the quaint, charming tavern of historical fiction. This was a rough, functional, and often dangerous place. Your room, if you were lucky enough to get one for yourself, would be a small, bare cell, a wooden bed with a straw-stuffed mattress that was likely home to a thriving ecosystem of fleas and other biting insects. There was no lock on the door. Security was non-existent. You would barricade the door with your pack and sleep with your money belt still strapped to your body. Often you wouldn't even get a private room. You would be assigned a spot on a mattress in a common dormitory, sharing your sleeping space with a dozen snoring, coughing, twitching strangers. The concept of personal space was a luxury for the rich in their private villas, not for the common traveller. Dinner would be a simple stew, cooked in a large pot over the main fire. Its ingredients a mystery you were better off not investigating. You would eat it quickly, hunched over a rough wooden table, keeping to yourself. You would drink a little wine, enough to dull the aches in your body, but not enough to dull your senses. And then you would retreat to your room, or your allotted patch of straw. You would not undress completely. You would simply lie down, pulling a scratchy wool blanket over yourself. The noise from the tavern below would travel up through the floorboards. The sounds from the courtyard, the braying of a donkey, a drunken argument, would filter in through the unglazed window. You would lie there in the dark, listening to the sounds of a world that never quite went to sleep. You would feel every bruise, every blister, every strained muscle. You were not resting, not truly. You were simply ceasing to move, allowing your exhausted body a few hours to try and repair itself before the entire cycle began again, in the cold, pre-dawn dark. The plan, the map, the carefully considered itinerary, they were all meaningless now. The only reality was the ache in your feet, the dust in your lungs, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today. The same road, the same sun, the same dust, the same slow, grinding, relentless rhythm. This was the daily grind of the Roman road. It was not an adventure, it was an act of endurance, and as you finally drifted off into a shallow, fitful sleep, your last thought was a simple one. You had survived its execution for one more day. Chapter 4. Perils of the Path. Bandits, breakdowns, and bad weather. You had survived its execution for one more day, but that simple, profound feeling of survival carried with it a quiet, gnawing understanding. The road itself, the monotonous, soul-crushing expanse of it, was only one of the executioners. It was the arena, the stage upon which other, more active and malevolent forces played their parts. Survival wasn't just about putting one foot in front of the other. It was about dodging the other actors who wanted to write you out of the play entirely, because the grind was the baseline reality, the constant pressure, but woven into that fabric of exhaustion were threads of pure, cold terror. The reality was that every step you took was a gamble. Every sunrise you were grateful to see was a sunrise some other poor soul on some other stretch of road had not. The daily grind was the devil you knew. Tonight, as we settle deeper into the quiet of the room, we're going to talk about the devils you didn't, the ones that lurked just beyond the reassuring crunch of your own footsteps waiting in the shadows of the Roman world. The first and most acutely personal of these fears had a name: latrones, bandits, highwaymen. It's a word that feels almost romantic now, something out of a storybook, but for the Roman traveller, it was a word that could dry the mouth and turn the blood to ice. These weren't charming rogues with a twinkle in their eye. They were a pervasive, terrifying, and brutally pragmatic part of the travel ecosystem. They were, if you will, the unofficial and highly aggressive toll collectors on the highways of the empire. To understand the fear, you have to understand the landscape of the mind. As you walked or rode, every copse of trees became a potential ambush site, every sharp bend in the road, a place where your line of sight was conveniently cut off. Every rocky outcrop in the hills was a perfect vantage point, not for you to admire the view, but for someone else to admire your baggage train. You begin to develop a kind of hyper-vigilance. The snap of a twig isn't just a squirrel, it's a signal. The distant call of a bird might not be a bird at all. You start to see faces in the shadows, to imagine movement where there is none. It's an exhausting way to live, layering a constant, simmering anxiety on top of your already profound physical weariness. You aren't just fighting the road anymore. You're fighting your own imagination, which has quite reasonably decided to become your worst enemy. And who were these figures that populated your nightmares? The popular image is of a hardened professional criminal, a career outlaw, and some were, but the reality was often more complicated, and perhaps more tragic. Many latrones were simply people for whom the grand Roman system had failed. They were legionary deserters, men trained in the art of killing, who found the discipline of army life unbearable, or the promise of plunder more appealing than a meagre salary. They were escaped slaves fleeing a life of unimaginable brutality, for whom any life, even one of skulking in the hills, was preferable. They were farmers whose land had been bought out from under them by some wealthy senator's expansive villa project, left with nothing but bitterness and a family to feed. They were local tribesmen in newly conquered territories, who saw the Romans not as civilizers, but as invaders who had stolen their ancestral lands and now paraded their wealth along these new, arrogant stone roads. They were, in short, the desperate, the dispossessed, people with nothing left to lose, which is precisely what makes a person so very dangerous. They weren't fighting for glory or ideology. They were fighting for your cloak, your boots, the grain in your cart, the coins in your purse, and because their own lives were worth so little in the grand scheme of the empire, they often placed an equally low value on yours. This wasn't business, it was survival, and they were just as weary and just as hungry as you were, only they had decided to solve the problem with a rusty blade and a distinct lack of moral compunction. Their methods were a study in brutal efficiency. They rarely, if ever, sought a fair fight. Their entire strategy was predicated on the element of surprise and overwhelming force applied for the briefest possible moment. They were masters of their local geography. They knew every cave, every hidden track, every narrow defile where a cart could be easily blocked. Mountain passes were their boardrooms. their corporate headquarters. A place like the Græan Alps, or the winding roads through the forests of Germania, or the rugged hills of Hispania, these were their domains. They would wait, sometimes for days, for the right kind of target: a lone merchant, a small family, a lightly guarded wagon. The attack itself would be a blur of terrifying speed. A log rolled across the road, a sudden volley of stones or arrows from the dense woods lining the path, shouts from all sides to create confusion, to make their small number seem like a legion. They would swarm the traveller before there was even time to draw a weapon or organize a defense. The violence was swift and decisive. Their goal was to incapacitate, terrify, and rob. Resistance was often met with an immediate and fatal response. Why risk a prolonged fight with an armed guard when a quick knife in the back would solve the problem just as effectively? They would strip you of everything, not just your money, but your food, your spare tunic, the sandals from your feet. They would take your mule, your cart, your very means of continuing your journey, and if you were unlucky, they might take you too. A wealthy merchant or a high-born lady could be held for a handsome ransom. A strong, healthy man or woman could be sold on the black market to a mine owner or a remote landowner who didn't ask too many questions. To be captured by Latrons was to simply vanish from the world, a ghost swallowed by the wilderness. So how did you even begin to protect yourself against such a threat? You couldn't just call the police. The Roman state had a concept of order, but it wasn't a modern one with patrol cars and emergency services. The roads were simply too vast, the wilderness too wild. The primary defense was the most obvious one: strength in numbers. No one who had any choice in the matter traveled alone. You would wait at a city gate or a major crossroads, sometimes for days, until a large enough group had assembled. This was the birth of the caravan. It was a temporary, mobile village of strangers, all bound by a single, shared goal: to make it to the next city without being murdered and robbed. The caravan was its own little social ecosystem. There were merchants with wagons full of wine or pottery, their hired guards walking alongside, weapons always ready. There were government officials with their slaves and clerks, carrying official correspondence. There were families moving to a new province, their life's possessions piled high on a groaning cart. There were pilgrims heading to a famous shrine, relying on divine protection and the safety of the group. There was a pecking order, of course. The wealthier travellers stayed in the centre, insulated by the less important bodies and carts around them. At night, they would form a circle, a laager of wagons with a fire in the middle. Men would take turns standing watch, peering into a darkness that felt alive and hostile, listening for any sound that was out of place. But even this was no guarantee. A large caravan was a more difficult target, but it was also a much more tempting one. A truly determined and well-organized gang of bandits might see it as the jackpot. It announced its presence from miles away with a cloud of dust and the noise of hundreds of feet and dozens of wheels. All a bandit leader had to do was bide his time, watch the caravan's routines, and pick his moment to strike, perhaps at dawn when the watch was tired and groggy. For those with the means, you could supplement this safety in numbers approach by hiring your own muscle. These were often retired legionaries, men who knew how to handle a sword and a shield, and whose scarred faces and grim demeanour were a deterrent in themselves. They were expensive, a significant business expense for any merchant. You had to weigh the cost of the guards against the potential loss of your cargo. It was a constant, stressful calculation, and sometimes the guards themselves weren't entirely trustworthy. A story of a security detail turning on their employer, leading him directly into an ambush set by their friends, was a cautionary tale told in every smoky inn along the road. You were paying for protection, but you were also inviting armed men you barely knew into your intimate circle, hoping their desire for your pay outweighed their desire for your possessions. The state did make an effort, of a sort. Along major economically vital highways, the Via Appia for instance, the government established stations. These were small forts or posts, manned by soldiers or a kind of road patrol militia. Their job was to provide a military presence, to show the flag, and to respond to major incidents, but they were few and far between. The distance between one station and the next could be a journey of several days. They could not possibly police every mile of the road. They were more like lighthouses on a vast, dark ocean, points of safety. but the waters in between were still teeming with sharks. In regions that were particularly notorious for banditry, a military governor might order a full-scale legionary sweep, sending cohorts of soldiers into the hills to hunt down the outlaws. This would pacify the area for a time. The bandits would be crucified along the roadside as a grisly warning to others, but as soon as the legions left, the poverty and desperation that created the bandits in the first place would remain, and slowly, like weeds growing back through the cracks in the stone, the bandits would return. The savvy traveller relied on information. Every time you stopped, at a town or a mancio, you would talk to people. You would listen to the gossip, the rumours. Which pass was currently considered a no-go zone? Where was the last attack? Was there a military patrol expected on this stretch of road soon? This web of information, this traveller's grapevine, was your most valuable tool. It might mean taking a longer, more arduous route to bypass a known danger spot. It was a choice between a week of extra travel and hardship, or a few hours of terror that could end your journey and your life permanently. You learned to travel not just with your eyes, but with your ears, treating rumour and whispers as a kind of map of human danger, overlaid on the physical map of the road. And so, even if you did everything right, joined a large caravan, hired guards, chose the safest route, the fear never truly went away. It was a constant travel companion, a cold presence sitting beside you on the cart. You survived the day, not through courage or skill, but through a fragile combination of planning, caution, and sheer dumb luck. And as you tried to sleep within the relative safety of the wagon circle, the crackle of the fire was a small comfort against the vast, rustling, watching darkness that surrounded you. A darkness that was not empty, but full of hungry, desperate men who saw your continued existence as a business opportunity. But the threats that stalked the Roman roads were not all human. In many ways, the human danger was at least comprehensible. A bandit wanted something. You could, in theory, negotiate with a bandit, or fight him, or hide from him. But you cannot negotiate with a mountain. You cannot reason with a flood. The natural world was an antagonist of breathtaking scale and utter indifference. It didn't want your money. It simply did not care if you lived or died, and in many ways that was a far more terrifying prospect. The bandits were a cancer on the road system. The natural world was the road system, in all its untamed, unforgiving glory. Let's start with the very ground beneath your feet, the terrain. We picture Roman roads as these perfect, straight lines cutting across the landscape, and in the flatlands they often were. But the empire was not flat. It was a realm of colossal mountain ranges. The Alps, the Pyrenees, the Apennines, the Taurus Mountains. To get from Italy to Gaul, or from Hispania to the rest of Europe, you had to go up and up and up. Crossing a major mountain pass was not a scenic detour. It was a life-threatening ordeal. The meticulously engineered Roman road would often give way to a narrow, winding track clinging to the side of a cliff. The air would grow thin and cold, making every breath a conscious effort, every step a drain on your already depleted energy. These passes were open for only a few months of the year. Travellers would rush to cross them in the summer, creating traffic jams of carts and mules and people, all desperate to get to the other side before the first snows fell. To be caught in a mountain pass by an early winter storm was a death sentence. The world would dissolve into a blinding whiteness. The track would disappear. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that leached the warmth from your body with terrifying speed. You would simply lie down in the snow, too exhausted to go on, and drift into a final frozen sleep. Entire caravans could be lost this way. Their remains discovered months later when the spring thaw revealed their silent frozen tableau. Even in good weather, the mountains were treacherous. Rockfalls were a constant danger. A sudden thunderous roar from above, as tons of stone and scree came crashing down onto the path. A single misplaced step could send a mule, a cart, or a person plunging thousands of feet into the valley below. The psychological toll was immense. You felt so small, so fragile, an insignificant speck crawling across the face of a vast and ancient being that could shrug you off with a contemptuous tremor. If you think driving on a modern mountain road with a guardrail can be nerve-wracking, imagine doing it on a gravel track barely wide enough for your cart, with a sheer drop on one side, and the constant unnerving feeling that the mountain itself is holding its breath, waiting for you to make a mistake. And when you descended from the mountains, The dangers merely changed their form. Rivers were the lifeblood of the empire, but they were also formidable barriers. While the Romans were master bridge builders, they couldn't bridge every river and stream. More often than not, a river crossing meant finding a shallow spot to ford. This was a perilous business. The current could be deceptively strong. A sudden surge of water from rain upstream could turn a gentle river into a raging torrent in minutes. Carts could be overturned, their contents swept away. Animals and people could lose their footing and be dragged under, their bodies found miles downstream, if they were found at all. And then there was the flash flood, the ultimate expression of nature's sudden, unpredictable violence. In the arid regions of North Africa or the Near East, you might be travelling along a dry riverbed, a wadi, which served as a convenient flat road, but a thunderstorm miles away, a storm you couldn't even see or hear, could send a wall of water roaring down the canyon with no warning. It was an unstoppable force, a liquid avalanche that scoured the landscape, taking everything with it: boulders, trees, carts, people. One moment you were walking on dry, cracked earth. The next you were consumed by a brown, churning chaos. The weather in general was a constant, capricious foe. The image of the Roman Empire is one of sunny Mediterranean skies, but that was only part of the story. The summer sun itself was a threat. On the long, shadeless stretches of road in places like Syria or southern Hispania, the heat was a physical blow. The air would shimmer. The stones of the road would radiate a furnace-like heat. Sunstroke was a real and present danger, a deadly fever that could fell the strongest traveller. Dehydration was your constant shadow. Your entire day revolved around the next well or spring, your wooden water flask the most precious item you owned. Then there was the rain. Not a gentle spring shower, but a relentless, driving downpour that could last for days. It turned the unpaved sections of the road into a quagmire, a thick, sucking mud that could pull the sandals from your feet and bog a heavy wagon down to its axles. Everything you owned would be damp. A cold, miserable chill would seep into your bones, a chill that no fire seemed to warm. This was the kind of dampness that led to coughs, to fevers, to pneumonia, what the Romans might have called a lung sickness, which could easily prove fatal in a world without antibiotics. And we cannot forget the wind. In the plains, it was a wearying, head-on force that you had to fight against with every step. It whipped dust and grit into your eyes and mouth, chafing your skin raw. In the mountains or along the coasts, it was a howling, malevolent spirit that threatened to tear the cloak from your back or push you from a narrow ledge. The wind was the sound of the wilderness, a constant reminder of its power and your own insignificance. Beyond these grand, dramatic threats were the smaller, more insidious ones, the invisible enemies. Chief among them was disease. In our modern world, we take clean drinking water for granted. For the Roman traveller, every drink was a roll of the dice. A clear, cool spring might be perfectly safe, but the well at a crowded inn, or a slow-moving stream that passed by a settlement upstream, could be teeming with invisible pathogens. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera. These were the silent killers of the road. A simple drink of contaminated water could lead to days of agonizing cramps, fever, and dehydration, often ending in a miserable, lonely death far from home. You would become a burden to your travelling companions, who would have to decide whether to stop and care for you, risking their own schedules and safety, or leave you behind in the nearest town, your fate in the hands of strangers. The food could be just as dangerous. The smoky, crowded kitchens of roadside inns were not models of hygiene. A bit of spoiled meat in the stew, some stale bread, could lead to a bout of food poisoning that would leave you weak and vulnerable for days. And the inns themselves, the kopane, were breeding grounds for sickness. You were crammed into small, poorly ventilated rooms with dozens of other unwashed, exhausted travellers from all corners of the empire. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were a given. But you were also sharing the air with people carrying all sorts of contagious diseases. A simple cough from the person sleeping on the straw next to you could be the beginning of a fatal illness. In the marshy, low-lying areas of Italy, like the infamous Pontine marshes, another invisible killer lurked: malaria, carried by the ubiquitous mosquito, bringing its cycles of fever and chills that could break even the strongest constitution. The natural world, then, was not a backdrop for the journey. It was an active participant. It was an obstacle course of mountains, a gauntlet of weather, and a minefield of invisible diseases. To travel through it was to be constantly aware of your own fragility. You were a warm, soft-bodied creature in a world of hard stone, raging water, and pitiless sun. Surviving the bandits felt like a victory against a foe. Surviving the elements felt more like you had simply been overlooked, that nature's indifferent gaze had passed over you for one more day. It was a humbling and deeply unsettling experience. And so, let's say you've navigated the bandit-infested hills, you've survived the treacherous mountain pass, you've drunk only from fast-flowing streams, and have somehow avoided the sickness, festering in the last inn. You feel a sense of relief, of accomplishment. The worst is surely behind you. And then you hear it, a sound that is, in its own way, more terrifying than the shout of an ambushing bandit or the rumble of a rockfall. It is a sharp, sickening crack from underneath your cart, a sudden lurch, and then a horrible, grinding stop. You have just entered the third circle of travel hell, the logistical breakdown. This is the danger that comes not from malice or indifference, but from simple, brutal physics and the fallibility of your own equipment. It is perhaps the most relatable of all the perils, the ancient equivalent of a flat tire or a dead engine on the loneliest highway imaginable. But the consequences were infinitely more severe. There was no calling for roadside assistance. There was no walking to the next service station. There was only you, your broken cart, and a silence that was suddenly filled with the weight of a monumental problem. Let's focus on that sound, the snap of a wooden axle. An axle was the single most critical component of a wagon. It bore the entire weight of your cargo, your family, your worldly possessions. It was subjected to constant stress, bouncing over uneven stones, jolting into ruts. You probably checked it every morning, but wood has hidden flaws. It can fatigue, and when it decides to go, it goes without warning. The cart sags, one wheel tilting at a drunken angle. You are, in a word, stranded. The first feeling is not panic, but a deep, sinking feeling of despair, a kind of numbness. You climb down from the cart and stare at the damage. The thick, once sturdy beam of oak is now a splintered mess. You are immobilized. You are a sitting duck. Every fear you had about bandits suddenly comes rushing back, tenfold. A moving target is difficult. A stationary one, loaded with goods, is an invitation. Your first instinct is to get off the road, to pull the cart into the trees and hide it. But you can't. It won't move. Now the frantic calculations begin. What are your options? Can you fix it? You might have a few basic tools, a saw, an axe, maybe an adze. But you need a new beam of seasoned hardwood. Where do you find that? You could chop down a nearby tree, but green wood is weak and won't last a mile. And shaping a new axle with hand tools is the work of a master craftsman, a wheelwright, and it would take days. Maybe you can splint it. You could try to lash the broken pieces together with rope, reinforcing them with smaller branches. It's a desperate, flimsy solution. You would have to unload most of your cargo, hiding it in the bushes and praying no one finds it. Then you could try to limp the now empty, wobbly cart to the next town. But how far is the next town? Is it a day's walk? 2? Do you leave someone, your wife, your children, your business partner, to guard the broken cart and the hidden goods while you go for help? The thought is unbearable, leaving them alone, exposed, while you walk for days, not even knowing if the town you're heading for has a craftsman capable of doing the repair. Or do you all go together, abandoning your cart and everything you own to fate, to the bandits, to any passerby who decides to help themselves? These were not easy choices. They were ruinous calculations of risk and loss. A broken axle wasn't an inconvenience. It was a potential catastrophe that could bankrupt you, or worse. It wasn't just the axle. A wheel could be just as problematic. The Roman wheel was a complex piece of engineering, with a hub, spokes, and a rim, often fitted with an iron tire. But the roads were rough. A hard jolt into a pothole could crack a spoke. A series of them could loosen the entire structure. The wheel would start to wobble, to groan in protest. You would have to stop constantly to check it, to hammer in wedges, to pray it held together. If the wheel itself shattered, you were in the same predicament as with a broken axle. The level of skill required to build a new wheel from scratch was something possessed by only a few specialists. Even your engine, your living, breathing source of motive power, was a point of extreme vulnerability. Your horse, your mules, your oxen, they were not machines, they were flesh and blood. A horse could cast a shoe, a simple common occurrence. But if you didn't have a spare and the tools to nail it on yourself, the animal would quickly go lame, its hoof worn down to the sensitive quick by the hard stone road. A lame horse is a useless horse. You would have to stop, or try to walk it slowly, painfully, to the next town in search of a blacksmith. Worse still, the animal could fall ill. It could drink from the same contaminated water source that threatened you. It could eat something poisonous by the roadside. It could simply be overworked, its great heart giving out from the strain. The loss of a draft animal was devastating. It was the loss of a huge financial investment. But it was often more than that. You spent every waking hour with these animals. You knew their personalities, their moods. There was a bond. To see one suffering, and to be powerless to help it, was heartbreaking. And then came the brutal decision. If the animal couldn't walk, what did you do? You couldn't stay with it forever. The road demanded you move on. The agony of having to abandon a trusted animal to die alone on the side of the road, or the grim necessity of ending its suffering yourself, was a trauma that would stay with a traveller forever. Being stranded by a breakdown transformed you. You were no longer a traveller. You were a refugee, a victim of circumstance. Your carefully laid plans, your schedule, your destination, all of it became meaningless. Your world shrank to the few square feet around your broken vehicle. Your priorities became primal: safety, water, food. Every person who approached on the road was a source of both hope and fear. Would they be a good Samaritan, willing to help, to offer food, to carry a message to the next town? Or would they see your plight as an opportunity, a chance to scavenge from your misfortune, or to prey on your vulnerability? A breakdown stripped away the veneer of civilization and left you utterly at the mercy of the road and its inhabitants. The psychological impact was profound. The frustration, the rage, the feeling of utter powerlessness. It could strain relationships to the breaking point. A husband and wife, once a team, might now bicker and blame each other for a poorly loaded cart or a missed warning sign. The driver might blame the merchant for overloading the wagon. The shared hardship, instead of binding people together, could just as easily drive them apart, the pressure cracking the foundations of their relationships just as surely as it cracked the axle of their cart. And so even the mundane, the mechanical, the logistical aspects of the journey were fraught with peril. It was a constant battle against entropy, against the tendency of all things to wear out and break down. The traveller had to be a jack of all trades, a navigator, a veterinarian, a mechanic, a carpenter. You had to be resourceful, resilient, and endlessly inventive, capable of patching up your world with a bit of rope and a prayer. The perils of the path were a trinity of threats: the malice of man, the indifference of nature, and the fallibility of your own creations. They were a constant, overlapping web of risk. A breakdown could leave you vulnerable to bandits. A storm in the mountains could cause a rockfall that breaks your cart. A delay caused by a lame horse could mean you reach the pass just as the first snows begin to fall. Everything was interconnected, a chain of causality where one piece of bad luck could trigger a cascade of disasters. To survive it all, to pull into the gates of the next city, your cart intact, your animals healthy, your family safe, was not just a relief, it was a triumph, a victory against all the forces that seemed to conspire to stop you. You had faced down the bandits, weathered the storm, and willed your rickety cart to hold together for one more day, for one more week. You had endured, and as you found a place to rest, the aches in your body were more than just pain, they were a testament to your resilience. But even in that moment of victory, you knew that tomorrow a new road awaited, and you knew that all of those same perils, the human, the natural, the mechanical, would be waiting for you there as well. Survival was never a permanent state of being, it was a temporary reprieve, a fleeting moment of peace before you had to gird yourself to face it all again. And after all that, after all the fear and struggle and sheer dumb luck that got you through the day, you still had one more challenge to face: finding a decent, or even halfway tolerable place to lay your head for the night. Chapter 5. Roadside Havens, the world of inns, mansions and way stations. And so, after a day spent wrestling with the whims of the road, the anxieties of potential ambush, the sheer physical exhaustion of it all, you were faced with that final, universal challenge. The sun dips low, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple, and every fibre of your being screams for rest. But the question hangs in the dusty air, heavy and insistent. Where? Where do you find a place to lay your head for the night that won't be worse than the dangers you've just escaped? The answer, like almost everything in the Roman world, depended entirely on who you were, for the vast sprawling empire, connected by its magnificent web of roads, was not one world but many, and nowhere was this clearer than when it came time to check in for the night. For a traveller of means, a senator, a wealthy equestrian, a man whose name carried weight, the question of lodging was less a source of anxiety and more a matter of social logistics. You see, the upper crust of Roman society operated within a closed private network of hospitality that was as solid and dependable as the roads themselves. This was the world of hospitium, a concept so much deeper and more resonant than our modern idea of simply having a friend with a spare room. Hospitium was a sacred formal bond, a pact of mutual guest friendship between families that could be passed down through generations. It was a solemn duty and a badge of honor. Think of it as the original social network, but one built on trust, honor, and intricate personal connections rather than digital algorithms. Before you even set out on your journey from Rome to, say, your villa in Gaul, your staff would have been busy. A swift rider, a trusted freedman perhaps, would have been dispatched weeks in advance, carrying letters to the various families along your route with whom your own family shared this bond. The letters were a delicate art form in themselves, part travel itinerary, part friendly greeting, part gentle reminder of the ancient ties that bound your houses together. They were the formal request for what was, in essence, a guaranteed 5-star stay. Sometimes the proof of this bond was a tangible object, a tessera hospitalis. This could be a small token, often an animal shape, made of clay or bone, which was broken in half. Your family kept one piece, and the host family kept the other. When you arrived, you could present your half, and it would fit perfectly with theirs, a physical key, unlocking the doors of their home to you. It was a beautiful, almost poetic symbol of a relationship built on two halves making a whole. It meant that even if the current heads of the family had never met, the children of the men who made the pact were still bound by it. You weren't just a guest, you were fulfilling a legacy, and what a reception awaited you. As your carriage rattled up the long cypress-lined driveway of a country villa, you wouldn't be met with suspicion or a weary sigh. You would be met with an entire household mobilized for your comfort. Servants would rush out to take your horses and your luggage. You would be ushered not into a grimy common room, but into the atrium, the heart of the home, where the master of the house would greet you personally. The first order of business, always, was the bath. You would be guided to the family's private bathhouse, a smaller, more intimate version of the grand public baths in the city. Here, you could soak away the grime and exhaustion of the road in hot, clean water, attended by slaves who would bring you fresh linens and fragrant oils. It was a ritual of purification, washing away the chaos of the outside world and welcoming you into the sanctuary of the home. Clean and refreshed, you would be shown to your quarters. There would be no question of sharing a room with a snoring stranger. You would be given a comfortable chamber, a cubiculum with a proper bed, soft wool blankets, and perhaps even a mosaic on the floor. The air would be clean, the silence broken only by the gentle sounds of a country estate. And then there was the dinner. You would recline on a couch in the triclinium, the formal dining room, alongside your host and his family. The meal would be a lavish affair, multiple courses of well-prepared food, good wine that hadn't been watered down to within an inch of its life, and most importantly, conversation. This was the real currency of hospitium. You would exchange news from the capital, discuss politics, philosophy, the latest poetry, or the price of grain. Business deals were struck, alliances were reinforced, and marriages were arranged in the soft glow of oil lamps during these roadside dinners. You weren't just a traveller being sheltered for the night. You were a vital link in the chain of information and influence that held the elite world together. You were safe, you were comfortable, you were among your own. This was the ideal, the dream of Roman travel, but it was a dream accessible only to a tiny fraction of the population. For everyone else, the reality of finding a bed for the night was a starkly and often dangerously different affair. If you weren't part of this exclusive club of interconnected villas, but were still important enough to be travelling on the emperor's dime, there was another option. This was the official state-sponsored network, a system designed not for comfort or luxury, but for ruthless efficiency. It was called the cursus publicus, the imperial post, and it was the nervous system of the Roman Empire. Its purpose was to move government officials, military dispatches, tax revenues, and important personnel across the vast provinces with the greatest possible speed and security. And to make that happen, the state had built its own chain of roadside facilities. To gain access to this world, you needed a special passport, a warrant called a diploma. This was a bronze tablet, issued by the emperor or a provincial governor, that certified you were on official business. It was your golden ticket. Without it, the doors of the state-run facilities remained firmly shut. A soldier with a spear and a very unimpressed expression would simply point you back toward the main road. But if you had one, you were part of the system. The crown jewels of this network were the mansions. These were essentially official state hotels, large complexes built at regular intervals along all the major highways, typically spaced one full day's journey apart, about 25 to 30 miles. A mansion wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a self-contained logistical hub. As you approached, you'd see a substantial, often fortified collection of buildings. There would be a large central courtyard, extensive stables capable of housing dozens of horses, and great storehouses, or horea filled with grain and provisions. There was a blacksmith on site to handle wagon repairs and reshoe horses, a veterinarian to check on the animals, and a detachment of soldiers to provide security. The experience of staying at a mansio was the polar opposite of the chaotic public inn. It was orderly, predictable, and one imagines a little dull. You would present your diploma to the station master, who would check it carefully before assigning you a room. The quarters were clean and functional. The food was basic but plentiful, drawn from the state granaries. You would eat in a common dining hall with other government functionaries, tax collectors comparing notes, surveyors discussing aqueduct routes, couriers weary from days of hard riding. But the greatest luxury a mansio offered, the one thing that truly set it apart from the common traveller's experience, was its own bathhouse. The ability to get properly clean at the end of a long day on the road was a blessing that cannot be overstated. After a soak and a simple meal, you could retire to your room with the knowledge that the gates were barred, the guards were on patrol, and you were as safe as you could be outside of a military fort. It was the sterile, impersonal comfort of government efficiency. It lacked the warmth and intellectual spark of a stay at a friend's villa, but it offered something almost as valuable: peace of mind. Between the grand mansions were smaller, more frequent outposts called mutations. These were not designed for overnight stays. They were the pit stops of the Roman world, spaced every 10 to 12 miles. A mutation was a horse-changing station, pure and simple. A courier on an urgent mission, galloping across the landscape, would ride his horse into the ground, arriving at a mutation just as the animal was about to give out. There, grooms would be waiting. Within minutes, his saddle and bags would be thrown onto a fresh, rested horse, and he would be off again, barely breaking stride. These stations were the secret to the incredible speed of Roman communication. They were the relay points that allowed the Emperor Tiberius to travel an astonishing 500 miles in 3 days to reach the deathbed of his brother. A mutation offered little for the traveller beyond fresh horses, a drink of water, and perhaps a place to rest in the shade for a few moments. They were the humble, workaday cogs in the mighty machine of imperial administration. The network of mansions and mutations was a marvel of logistics, a testament to Roman organizational genius. It ensured that the emperor's will could be transmitted, and his power projected, to the furthest corners of his domain with astonishing speed. But it's crucial to remember that this entire system operated in parallel to the world of the average traveller. If you were a merchant, a craftsman, a soldier on leave, a pilgrim, or just an ordinary person trying to get from one town to the next, the gates of the mansio were closed to you. Your world, your only option, was the world of the public inn, and that was a world of a very different colour indeed. This was the Capona, the roadside inn, the tavern, and if you believe the Roman writers who mention them, they were, without exception, the most wretched, dangerous, and morally bankrupt places in the entire empire. The Roman elite, who only ever saw these places from their litters as they hurried past on their way to a lovely villa, wrote about them with a mixture of disgust and horrified fascination. The poet Horace, on a journey down the Appian Way, complains of a coppermana filled with stingy boatmen and grasping landlords. The satirist Juvenal paints them as dens of assassins and brawling sailors. In Apuleius's The Golden Arse, the hero Lucius has a series of terrifying and bizarre adventures in a string of sordid inns, encountering witchcraft, murder, and all manner of depravity. The reputation of the Roman inn was, to put it mildly, abysmal. It was seen as the natural habitat of every lowlife the empire had to offer. Thieves, swindlers, runaway slaves, prostitutes and gamblers. And the man who presided over this carnival of vice was the innkeeper himself, the corpo. In Roman literature and law, the corpo is a stock character of utter untrustworthiness. He was universally assumed to be a cheat. It was taken for granted that he watered down his wine, served yesterday's questionable stew as today's special, gave you incorrect change, and charged exorbitant prices for foul-smelling, flea-bitten beds. Legal texts even grouped innkeepers together with sailors and stable-keepers as a class of people who were considered inherently less reliable, almost legally suspect by nature of their profession. There was a pervasive belief that many innkeepers were in league with local bandits. They would size up their guests, take note of who looked like they had a heavy coin purse, and then send a quiet message to their associates down the road. Staying at a capona wasn't just a matter of enduring discomfort, it was a calculated risk. And what did these places actually look like? Thanks to the remarkable preservation of cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, we don't have to guess. We can walk through the ruins of these very inns and get a vivid sense of the experience. Many were what we would call a tavern on the ground floor, and an inn on the floor above. The front of the building was often wide open to the dusty street, with a stone counter, a thermopolium, where passers-by could stop for a quick cup of warm wine, or a ladle of lentil stew from the clay pots, or dolia, set right into the counter. This was the fast food joint of the Roman world. To stay the night, you would step past this counter into the heart of the inn, and the first thing that would hit you, undoubtedly, would be the smell. A complex, eye-watering symphony of odours, stale wine, wood smoke from the hearth, unwashed bodies packed into a tight space, the sharp tang of cheap vinegar, and wafting in from the central courtyard, the unmistakable, pervasive aroma of the stables, because in many inns the animals were housed right there, just a few feet from where you ate. The distinction between space for humans and space for livestock was, shall we say, a fluid concept. The main room would be a dark, smoky and loud place. A handful of rough wooden tables and benches would be scattered around a packed earth or stone-flagged floor. The only light came from the open door, and perhaps a few sputtering, smoky oil lamps that did more to blacken the ceiling than to illuminate the room. Here, the clientele would be a motley crew, a merchant, tired and wary, trying to keep an eye on his goods, a pair of off-duty soldiers, gambling with dice and drinking heavily, a travelling actor, theatrically bemoaning his fortunes to anyone who would listen, a family, huddled together in a corner, trying to make themselves as small as possible. The noise would be a constant, overlapping din of conversation, arguments, laughter, and the clatter of dice on a wooden table. If you decided to risk the food, you wouldn't be ordering from a menu. You would get the dish of the day, likely a thick, bland porridge or a stew made from whatever was cheap and available. The bread would be coarse and hard. The wine, the lifeblood of the Roman world, would be the cheapest vintage, and as mentioned, almost certainly watered down. This wasn't just a matter of cheating the customer. It was also a rudimentary safety measure. Innkeepers knew that their establishments filled with armed men, strangers, and volatile tempers were powder kegs. Diluting the wine was one way to keep the level of drunkenness, and therefore the level of violence, from boiling over too quickly. When it was finally time to sleep, you would be led away from the relative warmth of the common room to the sleeping quarters. This is where the true misery began. The rooms, or cubicula, were often tiny, windowless cells, sometimes on the ground floor, sometimes on a rickety upper story. The bed might be a raised stone platform built against the wall, or a simple wooden frame. If you were lucky, there would be a mattress of sorts, a bag stuffed with straw or reeds. More often than not, you just got the straw. A single, coarse wool blanket, likely home to a thriving civilization of fleas and lice, would be your only covering. The complaints about bedbugs from Roman travellers are legion. They were an accepted, if loathed, part of the experience. There was no privacy. The walls were thin partitions of wood or plaster. You could hear every cough, every snore, every drunken argument from the rooms next to you. You would lie there in the dark, clutching your money pouch, listening to the unfamiliar sounds, wondering if the footsteps in the corridor belonged to another weary traveller or someone with less honest intentions. The door to your cell probably had a flimsy lock, if it had one at all. You might try to barricade it with your belongings. Sleep would not come easily. It would be a light, fitful and anxious state of rest. And in the morning you would wake, stiff and still tired, to pay the innkeeper his inflated price and get back on the road as quickly as possible, feeling not refreshed, but simply relieved to have survived the night. We can even read the reviews left by these ancient travellers, scrawled into the plaster walls of the inns themselves. The graffiti of Pompeii gives us an unfiltered glimpse into their thoughts. One traveller scratched a simple heartfelt complaint. "We have wet the bed. I confess, landlord, we have done wrong. If you ask why, it is because there was no chamber pot." Another offers a more direct critique of the business practices. "Innkeeper of the devil, may your fraudulent liquids be on your own head." These messages, scratched in a moment of frustration or humour 2,000 years ago, collapse time. They remind us that the anxieties and annoyances of travel, the bad service, the uncomfortable bed, the feeling of being ripped off, are a deeply, fundamentally human experience. So why would anyone subject themselves to this? The answer is simple. For the vast majority of people on the roads of the Roman Empire, there was no other choice. If you were a merchant moving your wares, a soldier heading to a new posting, an artisan seeking work in another city, you couldn't rely on a network of wealthy friends with spare villas. The state-run mansions were closed to you. The Corpona, with all its squalor and all its dangers. Was it? It was a vital, if unloved, piece of the empire's infrastructure. It was the dirty, noisy, essential engine room of Roman commerce and movement. It was where the real, unglamorous, everyday business of the empire got done. These inns were the melting pots of the Roman world, places where different classes, different ethnicities, and different professions were forced into close, uncomfortable contact. A Syrian trader might find himself sharing a bench with a Celtic auxiliary soldier, a Greek philosopher, and a local farmer. Ideas, languages, and diseases were exchanged in these smoky rooms just as readily as coins. To survive a night in a Corpona, a traveller needed to be savvy. You learned to ask other travellers on the road for recommendations, to find out which inns had a reputation for being merely bad, rather than actively lethal. You learned to travel in groups for safety. You learned to keep your money hidden and your wits about you. You learned to eat the stew without asking too many questions about its contents. You accepted the flea bites and the snoring neighbour as part of the price of passage. And so we have these three parallel worlds, all existing simultaneously along the same paved roads. The elite floating from one luxurious private villa to another, their journey cushioned by wealth and connections. The officials moving efficiently through their clean, safe and sterile network of state facilities, insulated from the populace by the power of their office. And then, everyone else, plunging into the vibrant, chaotic and perilous world of the common inn. It's a striking reminder that the Roman road, while connecting the empire physically, did not erase the vast social chasms that divided its people. Your experience of the world was dictated by your station. As the night deepens in the Corpona, the noise from the common room might finally begin to die down. The drunken soldiers may have passed out. The merchants retired to their rooms to worry about their cargo. In the relative quiet, you might lie on your straw mattress, feeling the draft from the poorly fitted door on your skin. You can hear the horses shuffling in the stables, the distant bark of a dog. You are keenly aware that you are a stranger in a strange place, a vulnerable traveller far from the safety of home, and yet you are sheltered. You are out of the rain, protected from the absolute darkness of the open road. The inn, for all its faults, has provided a haven. However imperfect, it is a brief pause, a moment to gather your strength before the sun rises, and you must once again face the uncertainties of the road. And as you finally drift off into a troubled sleep, your dreams are likely of your own bed, in your own home, a place of true safety and comfort, a feeling, perhaps not so different from the one you are beginning to feel right now, as you settle into the quiet and stillness of your own room, a world away from the noise and grime of the past. Chapter 6. arteries of commerce and culture, the broader impact of the roads. And in that quiet stillness of your own room, it's easy to forget that the world outside is never truly still. Even now, in the deepest hours of the night, trucks are moving on distant highways, carrying the things that will stock the shelves of your local store tomorrow. Data is flowing through invisible channels, and the quiet hum of the world's machinery never truly ceases. The Roman world was no different. That individual traveller we left, sleeping fitfully in that drafty roadside inn, was just a single blood cell in a vast circulatory system. And that system, the great network of stone-paved roads, was pumping something far more potent than just weary travellers from one end of the map to the other. It was pumping the very lifeblood of an empire. These roads were more than just a convenience for the legionary or the tax collector. They were the arteries and veins through which the entire Roman economy, its culture, and its very identity flowed. They were the physical manifestation of what we might now call a globalized world. Before these roads, the world was a patchwork of isolated communities. A farmer in Gaul and a merchant in Syria might as well have lived on different planets. After the roads, they were connected, however tenuously. They were part of the same grand, sprawling, and often messy project. Let's first think about the most tangible thing that moved along these roads. Stuff. Just things. The sheer volume and variety of goods that trundled along the Via Appia or the Via Egnatia would be staggering. This wasn't just local farmers bringing a few chickens to the nearest market town. This was industrial-scale logistics. This was the ancient world's version of Amazon Prime, only instead of a cardboard box arriving in 2 days, it was a massive clay amphora filled with Spanish olive oil, arriving in 2 months, after a journey that would have been utterly impossible just a few generations prior. The undisputed king of all commodities was grain. You see, the city of Rome itself was a paradox. It was the most powerful city in the world, and yet it was completely, utterly incapable of feeding itself. By the height of the empire, over 1 million people were packed into that sprawling metropolis. The farms of the Italian peninsula couldn't even begin to satisfy that ravenous appetite. Rome was a giant, magnificent parasite, and it needed a constant, uninterrupted flow of food just to survive from one day to the next. This is where the roads and their maritime partners became a matter of life and death. The primary breadbasket of the empire was Egypt. The annual Nile flood created miraculously fertile land, producing vast surpluses of wheat. Every year, after the harvest, a colossal fleet of grain ships, the Classis Alexandrina, would set sail from Alexandria. These weren't little fishing boats. They were the supertankers of their day, purpose-built cargo ships that could carry hundreds of tons of grain. Their journey across the Mediterranean was perilous, a race against the unpredictable sea, but once they arrived at the port of Puteoli, or later, Ostia, the road network took over. Imagine the scene. A mountain of grain, sacked and sealed, is offloaded onto the docks. An army of labourers, sweating under the Italian sun, heaves the sacks onto sturdy, broad-wheeled wagons, the kind designed specifically for the paved roads. These wagons, pulled by teams of straining oxen or mules, would then begin the final, crucial leg of the journey, rumbling up the Via Portuensis directly into the granaries of Rome. This wasn't just a supply chain, it was a state-run lifeline. The emperor's legitimacy rested, in no small part, on his ability to provide the grain dole. If that supply of grain was ever interrupted by pirates, by storms, by a rebellion in Egypt, the mood in the capital would turn ugly fast. The roads ensured that the final overland part of this vital journey was as reliable and swift as humanly possible. The steady clatter of those grain wagons on the stone pavers was the very heartbeat of the city. But it wasn't just about basic survival. The roads enabled a level of consumer choice and luxury for the Roman elite that was unprecedented. Take wine. While Italy produced plenty of its own, the wealthy developed a taste for imported vintages. From the vineyards of Gaul, modern-day France, came barrels of wine, transported down the Rhone River and then overland into Italy. From Hispania, or Spain, came not just wine but also a vast quantity of another essential liquid, olive oil. It's hard for us to grasp just how central olive oil was to the Roman world. It was far more than a cooking ingredient. It was their soap, their moisturizer, their lamp fuel, their sports drink. Athletes would slather themselves in it before competing. and then scrape it off, along with the dirt and sweat, with a tool called a strigil. At night, a tiny clay lamp burning a wick in a pool of olive oil was the only thing standing between a family and total darkness. It was a fundamental utility, and Spain was the undisputed champion of olive oil production. Huge estates, the latifundia, covered southern Spain, their hillsides blanketed with the silvery green leaves of olive trees. The oil was pressed and poured into a very specific type of large globular clay jar, an amphora known to archaeologists as a Dressel 20. These jars were the shipping containers of the ancient world. They were stamped with information about the producer, the weight, the origin, all the data needed for quality control. Tens of thousands of these amphorae were loaded onto ships, and then, again, onto wagons to be distributed throughout the empire. In Rome there is a hill called Monte Testaccio. It's not a natural hill, it is an artificial mound, a landfill, made entirely from the shattered remains of an estimated 53 million olive oil amphorae, mostly from Spain. It is a staggering, monumental testament to the sheer scale of the trade that the roads and shipping lanes made possible. Every shard of pottery in that hill is a ghost of a journey made, a data point in the story of the empire's interconnected economy. And then there were the luxuries, the things nobody truly needed, but everyone with money desperately wanted. The roads were the final leg of the legendary Silk Road. From the distant, almost mythical lands of the Ceres, the Chinese, came bolts of shimmering silk, a fabric so light and fine that it was considered both magical and scandalously revealing. This silk travelled for thousands of miles, passing through the hands of countless middlemen in Parthia and Persia, before it reached the Roman frontier in Syria. There, it was loaded onto Roman wagons and transported to the great cities of the Levant, like Antioch, and then shipped or carted overland to Rome. Senators like Seneca the Younger fumed about the moral decay represented by this fabric, which cost its weight in gold and, in his view, did little to conceal the modesty of the Roman matrons who wore it. He also lamented the massive trade deficit, the river of Roman gold and silver flowing east to pay for these trifles, but the demand was insatiable. Along with silk came spices from India and Arabia, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, that made Roman food palatable and were used in perfumes and medicines. Incense, like frankincense and myrrh, essential for religious ceremonies, made the long journey from the southern Arabian peninsula. Wild animals for the games in the Colosseum, lions from North Africa, bears from Caledonia, tigers from the east were caged and carted along these same roads, a terrifying and exotic cargo. Amber from the Baltic coast, a substance the Romans called electrum and believed to be solidified sunlight, was traded down through Germanic tribes until it reached the Roman frontier and was carried south. Each of these items tells a story of a journey, of a vast network of people and infrastructure, all dedicated to moving things from where they were to where they were wanted. The roads made the empire a single, colossal marketplace. A wealthy senator in Britain could dine using a silver spoon from a Spanish mine, season his food with pepper from India, drink wine from Gaul out of a glass vessel made in Egypt, all while his wife wore a silk gown from China. This was a world connected by desire, and the roads were the conduits of that desire. This constant flow of goods had a profound effect on the landscape itself. It allowed cities to grow to sizes that would have been impossible before. A city is a hungry beast. It consumes food, water, fuel, and raw materials, and it produces waste. Without an efficient way to bring in the former, and to a lesser extent get rid of the latter, a city simply chokes on its own existence. The Roman roads were the feeding tubes that allowed places like Rome, Alexandria, Antioch and Carthage to swell into bustling metropolises of hundreds of thousands of people. These cities became hubs, nodes in the network. A city like Lugdunum, modern Lyon in France, was a perfect example. It sat at the confluence of major rivers and was the starting point for a spiderweb of Roman roads spreading out across Gaul. It became the administrative and economic capital of the entire region. Goods would flow in from all directions, get processed, taxed, and sent on their way. This created jobs, wealth, and a concentration of people, which in turn created a market for more goods and services. The roads and the cities grew together, locked in a cycle of mutual reinforcement. The roads fed the cities, and the cities provided the reason and the resources for the roads to be maintained and expanded. But the wagons rumbling along these stone highways were carrying more than just grain and wine and silk. They were carrying something far more powerful, far more transformative. They were carrying ideas. The roads were conduits of culture, the physical means by which the empire became not just a political entity, but a shared civilization. This process is often called Romanization, and it happened largely because of the connections the roads made possible. Imagine you are a young man from a Gallic tribe. Your world has for generations been one of small villages, local traditions, and a specific Celtic dialect. Then the Romans come. They build one of their dead straight, impossibly durable roads right through your ancestral lands. At first it's just for the soldiers, those intimidating men in their segmented armor, marching with unnerving discipline. But then other people start using the road, merchants with their wagons, speaking a strange, clipped language called Latin. Administrators arrive, setting up a small office in a nearby town to count people and collect taxes. They bring with them scrolls covered in Roman law, a system of rules and contracts that is bewilderingly complex but also, in its own way, predictable and fair. To get a better price for your grain, you find you need to learn a few words of Latin. To resolve a dispute with a neighbour over a boundary stone, you find yourself appealing to a Roman magistrate who consults his written laws rather than relying on the village elder's memory. A rich landowner down the valley builds a new house, a villa, but he doesn't build it in the traditional Gallic style. He builds it like the houses he's seen in Italy, with a central courtyard, mosaic floors, and even a bathhouse with heated floors. He's adopted a Roman way of living because it's associated with wealth, power, and sophistication. The roads brought these things. They brought the language of administration and commerce, Latin, which gradually overlaid and then, in many places, replaced the local tongues. They brought the logic of Roman law, which provided a common framework for business across the entire Mediterranean. They brought Roman architectural styles, travel to any corner of the former empire, from the north of England to the deserts of Jordan, and you will find the ruins of the same basic buildings, the forum, the basilica, the amphitheatre, the public baths. Engineers and architects travelled the roads, carrying standardized plans and techniques with them. It was like a cultural software package being installed across a vast computer network. You could be dropped into a medium-sized town in Britain or in North Africa, and if you headed for the city centre, you'd know roughly what to expect. You'd find a public square, a courthouse, and a temple, all arranged in a familiar pattern. This created a shared physical and mental landscape, a sense of belonging to something larger than your own tribe or village. This Romanization wasn't always a deliberate policy of cultural imperialism, though it could be. More often, it was a process of attraction and imitation. Local elites saw the advantages of adopting Roman ways, speaking Latin, wearing a toga, understanding Roman law. These were the keys to power, influence, and wealth within the new system. The roads were their gateway to this new world. A provincial aristocrat could send his son along the road to be educated in Rome itself, or in one of the great finishing schools of the empire, like Athens or Alexandria. When that son returned, he brought with him not just an education, but a whole set of cultural assumptions, tastes and habits that he would then spread among his own community. The roads ensured that the provinces weren't isolated backwaters. They were connected to the cultural heart of the empire, and the pulse that beat in Rome could be felt, however faintly, all the way to the frontiers. Of course, the flow of culture wasn't just a one-way street, from the centre to the periphery. The roads also brought the provinces to Rome, as soldiers, slaves, merchants and officials from across the empire travelled to the capital. They brought their own gods, their own foods, and their own customs with them. Rome became a truly cosmopolitan city, a melting pot of cultures. You could hear dozens of different languages spoken in the forum. You could find temples dedicated to Egyptian goddesses like Isis, or to the Persian sun god Mithras, nestled among the traditional Roman temples. This was another unintended consequence of the network. The very roads designed to project Roman power and culture outwards also served to bring the diversity of the world back to the empire's core. Perhaps the most profound and world-changing idea to travel along these roads was not Roman at all. It was a new and radical religious belief that emerged from the troublesome province of Judea. The story of the spread of early Christianity is inextricably linked to the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. The very system designed for military conquest and imperial administration became the perfect vehicle for a faith that preached peace and universal brotherhood. Consider the journeys of the Apostle Paul. He was, in many ways, the archetypal Roman traveller of his time. He was a Roman citizen, which afforded him legal protections and the right to travel freely, and travel he did. His missionary journeys, as described in the Acts of the Apostles, are essentially a travelogue of the Eastern Roman Empire. He moved from city to city, from Antioch to Ephesus, through Macedonia and Greece, and eventually to Rome itself. And how did he travel between these places? He walked. He walked on the Roman roads. He would have used the Via Egnatia, the great Roman road that cut across northern Greece, connecting the Aegean and Adriatic seas. He travelled the roads of Asia Minor, which were some of the oldest and best established in the empire. When he was shipwrecked on Malta, he was being transported as a prisoner along the primary sea and land routes to the capital. The roads took him to the major urban centres, the very hubs of commerce and culture we were just discussing. These were the places where people from all walks of life mingled, where new ideas could find a receptive audience. Paul would go to the local synagogue first, and then to the public marketplace, the agora, and he would talk to people. He would share his message. His letters, which form a substantial part of the New Testament, were then carried along these same routes by messengers. A letter written in Corinth could be reliably delivered to the nascent Christian community in Rome. The roads provided the means for these scattered, fledgling communities to stay in touch, to share texts, to debate theology, and to offer each other support. Without the Roman roads, Christianity might have remained a small, localized Jewish sect. With them it was able to spread with astonishing speed, planting itself in the key cities of the empire within just a few decades of the death of Jesus. It's a remarkable irony. The Roman state, which would later persecute Christians with great brutality, had unwittingly created the perfect incubator for the new faith. They built the roads to move soldiers, but the missionaries and their message moved faster. They established a common language, or at least a widely understood one in the form of Koine Greek in the East and Latin in the West, which allowed the message to transcend local dialects. They created an era of relative peace and stability, the Pax Romana, which made long-distance travel safer than it had ever been before. An apostle like Paul could journey for thousands of miles with a reasonable expectation of not being murdered by bandits along the way, a luxury his ancestors could only have dreamed of. And it wasn't just Christianity. Other so-called mystery religions also used the roads to spread. The cult of Mithras, a figure associated with bulls and celestial alignments, was particularly popular among soldiers. As legions were transferred from one frontier to another, from Syria to the Rhine, from the Danube to Britain, they took their faith with them. Archaeologists have found Mithric temples or Mithraea in the ruins of Roman forts all along the empire's borders. The roads that carried the eagles of the legions also carried their secret gods. So you see, the impact of these stone-paved lines on the map goes far beyond simple transportation. They were the circulatory system that kept the body of the empire alive, pumping goods to feed its massive population. But they were also the empire's nervous system, transmitting cultural signals, legal codes, and new ideas from the brain in Rome to the farthest limbs of the provinces, and just as importantly, carrying sensory information from those limbs back to the center. They stitched a diverse and chaotic world together, creating a shared space where a Spaniard and a Syrian could, for the first time in history, be part of the same story. As you lie there feeling the weight of your own comfortable bed, a world away from the dust and clamour of a Roman highway, you can perhaps appreciate the silence. But in that silence, you can also imagine the faint, ghostly echo of those journeys. The slow, rhythmic creak of a wagon's axle, carrying grain to a hungry city, the soft shuffle of a scholar's sandals, carrying a scroll of Greek philosophy to a new library in Gaul, the earnest, quiet voice of a missionary, explaining a strange new faith to a curious shopkeeper in Corinth. All of these sounds, all of these moments, were made possible by the road. It was the stage upon which the great drama of the Roman world unfolded. It was an innovation as profound as the printing press or the internet, fundamentally reshaping not just how people moved, but how they lived, how they traded, what they believed, and who they were. The roads were not just built on the landscape, they built the landscape of an entire civilization. a foundation of stone that would in time give way to new powers and new ideas, many of which had, ironically, travelled those very roads to their destiny. Chapter 7. The Long Sunset. Decay and Legacy of the Roman Roads. So there it was, a network of stone and purpose, an empire's circulatory system, pumping legions and laws and olive oil to the furthest fingertips of the known world, an innovation so profound that it built the very landscape of a civilization. But here's the quiet truth about any great system. Whether it's a star, a body, or an empire, it requires a constant, ferocious input of energy to fight off the inevitable, patient creep of chaos. And for the Roman roads, the day came when the energy was simply cut off. The furnace at the heart of the empire grew cold, and the long, slow, inexorable process of unravelling began. The destiny that had travelled so swiftly along those roads had arrived, and it was a destiny of fragmentation, of silence and of weeds. It didn't happen overnight. There was no grand ceremony decommissioning the roads, no final cart rattling off into the sunset. It was a process of 1,000 tiny failures, a death by 1,000,000 quiet surrenders. The first and most important thing to disappear wasn't a stone or a bridge, but an idea, the idea of central maintenance. For centuries, the existence of a single overarching authority meant that if a bridge washed out in northern Britannia, it was, in a very real sense, the emperor's problem. An army of engineers, surveyors and labourers, funded by a vast and complex bureaucracy, was tasked with keeping the arteries of the empire clear. But as the 5th century saw the Western Empire crumble into a patchwork of competing kingdoms and local strongmen, that bureaucracy simply evaporated. The paychecks stopped coming. The overseers went home. The grand concept of a unified public works project, perhaps one of the greatest in human history, dissolved like sugar in the rain, and into that vacuum of authority crept a new, silent, and infinitely patient master, neglect. Imagine you are a traveller in the year 500, then 550, then 600. At first the changes are subtle. The road is still magnificent, a clear testament to the giants who built it. But you notice the drainage ditches, once so meticulously cleared, are beginning to fill with silt and leaves. Water starts to pool on the road surface after a storm. Instead of being whisked away, the curbstones are a little looser in places. A small tree, a determined little sapling, has found purchase in a tiny crack between two massive paving stones. A few years ago, a road crew would have plucked it out without a second thought. Now it is left to grow. It is a tiny green flag of a new world order, one that doesn't have a budget for weeding. Then, the bigger problems start. That pooling water is a relentless enemy. In the winter, it freezes. Water, as we know, has the curious property of expanding when it turns to ice, and it does so with a slow, irresistible force. The ice becomes a tiny, powerful jack, pushing the stones apart, just a millimetre at a time. The next thaw, more water gets into the now slightly wider crack. The next freeze, the jack pushes a little harder. Season after season, year after year, the greatest engineering of the ancient world is being dismantled by the humble frost. The perfectly interlocking stones, the pride of the Roman engineer, begin to rock and shift. The road develops a kind of arthritis, its joints growing stiff and uneven. Potholes appear, and these aren't the kind that jostle your coffee in the cup holder. These are axle-snapping, cart-wrecking craters that grow deeper and wider with every passing season. The vegetation, once held at bay by constant traffic and maintenance, now sees its opportunity. The green tide rolls in. What started as weeds and saplings in the cracks becomes a full-blown reconquest by nature. Grass and moss soften the hard edges of the road. Brambles and thorny bushes creep in from the verges, narrowing the usable path. In less travelled areas, the forest simply reclaims its own. The road becomes a ghost, a faint, straight line of harder ground beneath a carpet of leaves and trees, visible only to the most discerning eye, or perhaps from the air. The sounds of the road change too. The rhythmic clatter of hobnailed sandals, the groan of cartwheels, the shouts of mule drivers. They fade. They are replaced by the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the unsettling silence of a path that is slowly being forgotten. It's the sound of a civilization's voice growing hoarse, and then falling silent. And what of the great works, the bridges, the viaducts, the tunnels. These were the high watermarks of Roman confidence, their defiance of terrain. But a bridge is a complex, fragile thing. It requires constant vigilance. A single heavy flood could scour the foundations of a stone pier. Without engineers to inspect and repair that damage, the next flood would do more, and the next more still. Eventually, the inevitable would happen. A keystone would slip, a pier would give way. With a great groan of tearing mortar and splitting stone, a magnificent arch, one that had stood for 400 years, would collapse into the river below. The effect of a single collapsed bridge was catastrophic. It didn't just inconvenience travellers, it amputated a limb from the network. A road that had once run for 100 miles in a dead straight line was now severed. The entire route became useless for long-distance trade. The journey now required a dangerous fording of the river, or a long, arduous detour through trackless country. That single point of failure sent ripples of disconnection throughout the entire region. Towns that had thrived on the trade that flowed past their gates began to wither. Communities became more isolated. The world, which the roads had made so vast and interconnected, began to shrink. But neglect and nature weren't the only forces at work. The roads also fell victim to a very human, very pragmatic kind of destruction. As the old order fell away, a new one arose, a world of local lords, fortified towns, and an ever-present need for security. And in this new reality, the Roman roads were seen not as a sacred piece of infrastructure, but as something else entirely, the world's largest, most convenient, pre-cut quarry. Imagine you are a medieval baron in, say, Gaul, in the 9th century. You need to build a defensive wall for your town, or perhaps a new, sturdier castle. You need stone. You could spend a vast amount of time and labour quarrying new stone from a nearby hillside, dressing it, and hauling it to your building site. Or you could turn your attention to that remarkably straight, unusually flat stretch of land just outside your village, the one paved with thousands upon thousands of perfectly shaped, durable, high-quality stone blocks, already cut to manageable sizes by long-dead masters. It's essentially a flat-pack castle kit, just lying there for the taking. The decision, from a purely practical standpoint, is no decision at all. The great roads were systematically cannibalized. People with crowbars and carts would pry up the paving stones and haul them away. They took the curbstones. They dug down to the layers of compacted gravel and rock that formed the foundation, the statumen and the rudus, and used it for aggregate in their own walls. The Via Appia, the Queen of Roads, was plundered for its stone to build the towers and fortifications of medieval Roman families. All across Europe, the legacy of Roman engineering was being repurposed, one block at a time, to build the defensive, fragmented world of the Middle Ages. The stones that were meant to connect an empire were now being used to build the walls that would divide it. It was seen less as desecrating a masterpiece, and more as churches, cathedrals, town walls, farmhouses. A surprising amount of early medieval Europe is built, quite literally from the ruins of the Roman road network. And with the physical decay came the social decay. The Roman road was more than just a surface, it was a system. It was the cursus publicus, the state-run postal and transport service. It was the chain of mansions, those state-sponsored inns, placed a day's journey apart, where official travellers could find a hot meal, a fresh horse, and a relatively safe place to sleep. It was the presence of legions, of patrols, that made the roads secure. All of this vanished. The mansions fell into ruin, or were converted into private, often squalid inns. Security became a distant memory. The roads, especially in forested or mountainous areas, became the domain of the bandit and the outlaw. A journey was no longer a matter of logistics. It was a matter of life and death. The question was not how long will it take, but will we make it at all? A merchant travelling with valuable goods would need to hire a small army of guards. The cost of transport skyrocketed. It became cheaper and safer, once again, to move heavy goods by water where possible. For the average person, long-distance travel simply ceased to be a realistic option. The world beyond your own valley became a place of myth and rumour. Generations were born, lived and died without ever travelling more than 20 miles from their home village. The social and intellectual cross-pollination that the roads had made possible, the easy exchange of ideas, technologies and cultures, slowed to a trickle. The internet of the ancient world was being unplugged, one dead server, one broken link at a time. And yet, the roads did not die completely. They endured. Their ghosts haunted the European landscape, and in many places their bones still provided the best path forward. A road that is well-sited and well-built is a difficult thing to erase entirely, even when the paving stones were gone and the surface had returned to dirt. The fundamental route, that straight determined line, often remained the most logical way to get from point A to point B. So the roads entered a new phase of their existence. They became local tracks, farm lanes, and drove roads. The Grand Imperial Highway became a muddy path, wide enough for a single cart, but still following the unerring line of a Roman surveyor. In some places, centuries of use wore these old roads down, creating deep sunken lanes, or hollowways, where you can walk today with banks of earth and tree roots rising high on either side of you. To walk in one of these is to walk in a trench carved by time, following a path laid down by an empire that has been dust for 1,500 years. Some of the most important routes survived because they found a new purpose. The rise of Christianity gave the roads a new lease on life as pilgrimage routes. The old road to Rome was no longer trod by legions but by penitents and pilgrims, seeking the heart of their faith. The Via Francigena, a major medieval pilgrimage route from Canterbury to Rome, follows the path of old Roman roads for much of its length. These roads, once built for the purpose of worldly power and conquest, were now paths to spiritual salvation. The god of the crossroads, Mercury, was replaced by the cross of Christ, but the road itself remained. And this, really, is the final astonishing legacy of the Roman roads. They are still with us. Their phantom presence lies just beneath the surface of modern Europe. When you drive along the A1 in Britain, the old Great North Road, you are following the course of the Roman Dera Street and Ermini Street. When you travel certain routes in France, Italy or Spain, you are tracing a line first surveyed by a man in a toga with a grooved sighting staff called a groma. The modern network of European highways owes an incredible, often unacknowledged debt to its Roman predecessor. The Romans had a genius for finding the most efficient, most direct, most topographically sensible route, and that logic is as sound today as it was 2 millennia ago. Your satellite navigation system, with its cool, calm voice, is in many ways just channeling the spirit of a Roman engineer who decided that this was, and always would be, the best way to go. Even the phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," resonates to this day. We use it metaphorically, of course, to mean that many paths can lead to the same result, but it is a ghost of a literal truth. For centuries, the entire system was designed with Rome as its heart, its golden milestone from which all distances were measured. The phrase is a testament to the sheer audacity and centralizing vision of the project. It speaks of a time when the world was woven together in a way it would not be again for more than 1,000 years. So, as we settle in tonight, let's imagine that final long sunset over the Roman world. Picture a stretch of a great road, somewhere in the provinces. The last of the paving stones are being pried up to build a wall for a small, frightened town. The drainage ditch is choked with mud. A bridge in the distance has long since collapsed, its stone piers standing in the river like lonely teeth. The road is no longer a proud, straight artery of commerce and power. It is becoming a faint track through the encroaching wilderness. The silence is profound. The tramp of legions has been replaced by the whisper of the wind. The rattle of carts has been replaced by the scuttling of small animals in the undergrowth. The road is not dying in a blaze of glory. It is simply fading. It is being absorbed back into the land from which it came. But its work is not quite done. Its ghost will remain, a stubborn line on the landscape, a memory of order in an age of chaos. It will become a path for pilgrims, a track for farmers, a foundation for future highways. It is a quiet reminder that nothing built by human hands is permanent, but that a good idea, a logical path, a well-made thing, can echo through the centuries in the most unexpected ways. The empire is gone, the builders are gone, the world they knew is gone, but the road in its own quiet, stubborn way endures. It's a foundation of stone, now buried under the foundations of our own world, a deep and steadying presence, holding us up, even as we sleep.